If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this.
Outdoors people, share your strange and creepy experiences in the deep woods, forests, or any scary encounters with cryptids, creatures, unknown beings, or otherworldly phenomena.
I'm pretty sure I've seen acoustica, even though a part of me is really confused about whether they are real or not. I've seen and heard weird shit, but this is the absolute clearest, most certain place I have ever been. I am going to preface this with some things. I was 10-ish years old. I can't remember exactly how old I was, but I knew I went to this camp at those ages. There are no drugs or alcohol involved, obviously. I grew up hearing and doubting the stories. I wasn't just looking for weird shit and convincing myself. I had woken up before the other girls in my cabin, so I was trying to be quiet. I didn't want to move around and make the bed creak to get a book, so I just watched out the window at the water. There was a float dock by the shore, quite a bit out. I suck at estimating distances, but it was far enough that I thought it was weird to see a man standing on the dock with no canoes, boats, or anything nearby. He was fully clothed too and didn't look soaking wet, so I knew he didn't swim there. He looked older too, much older than our college-aged and younger counselors. I watched him quietly, curious as to what someone would be doing out there without a way back. He went to jump in, and he leapt higher than I expected. Mid-jump, he turned into a slender, smaller figure. I realized after replaying that moment in my mind that it looked like an otter. I'm Tlingit, and I was raised being told about the shapeshifters and that they are also known as the land otter people and will disguise themselves as otters to fool humans. I kept watching, but he never came back. Except for one Native American counselor, no one would believe me, save for one counselor who is also Native American. He told me he was going to the bathroom one night and heard a baby crying from the woods. He may or may not have been messing with me. It can be difficult for me to pick up on that, especially back then, but he did seem sincere. This has happened several times while hiking in a specific, general area, around 10,000 acres, in New Hampshire, US. Looking at my watch or noticing the position of the sun in the sky, it's hours later in the day than it should be. I can't explain the lost time. This area was settled by Abenaki in the old days. There is at least one artifact, a bowl carved in a rock ledge near a waterfall, that was recorded by archaeologists. An Indian trail is shown on old maps. I have found petroglyphs, I suspect, graves, and other things. The area was settled by Europeans for a time, but they all left or died. There are only cellar holes and cemeteries now. Everything has returned to the woods. There is a lot of iron in the bedrock. Compasses don't always work right. It seems to me that lightning hits some of the hills much more often than is typical, though I'm not any kind of expert in that field. I am experienced in hiking and camping in the woods. The amount of lightning scars on trees is crazy, in my opinion. I don't drink or use drugs. I have never had lost time anywhere else. I think they are called will-o'-the-wisps, or a floating load over the swaps. In the scariest few moments of my life, I had no idea what was going on. I was in the pines down a dirt road, taking night photos after midnight. I've done this hundreds of times, but it was so quiet, and still, it was kind of weird. A red old pickup truck was driving slowly and shining a flashlight into the bog, which weirded me out. It's not often that a car or two will pass, so I'm on high alert, but they were shining their flashlights out of the truck, checking the bank of the bog, which freaked me out. They stopped on the bridge, got out, and were looking over the edge for like 5 minutes in the opposite direction of me. After those 5 minutes, they turned their flashlights off and floored it down the dirt road. About 10 minutes later, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a flashlight again, but I didn't hear anyone or anything. I kind of ducked behind some trees because I didn't know who it was. Then it went away. Popped back up again, but it was definitely over the eater from my direction, floated across the water, and went out again after a few seconds. I packed my crap and left. The weirdest part was that the truck was looking in the direction the light came from, and I only saw it for about 30 seconds until I saw that ball light definition online. Word coincidence, ghost, or Jersey Devil? This was the one strange story that my father would tell. It terrified me as a child, and even today, it gives me chills. He would drive from New York up to Canada back and forth because he was from Quebec and could speak French. He had a big 18-wheeler with a bunk in the back of the cab, so he'd usually just sleep in the truck on the side of the road. One night he pulled over and went in the bunk, and while drifting off to sleep, he could hear footsteps in the gravel coming toward the truck. He was dismissed as an animal. He was in a remote location. The footsteps went all the way along the side of the truck, behind the truck, and back up the other side. Kind of suspicious. Then something tried to open the door handle, so he knew it wasn't an animal. That's when he got very scared. Whatever it was moved in front of the truck and stopped. It didn't walk away. It just stopped. So my father looked out the front of the truck, and he could see a figure standing about 10 feet in front of it. So he turned the headlights on, and apparently there was some kind of humanoid, man, or creature standing in front of him. My father said that it was basically really covered with hair, either matted beard or what, but it also had reflective eyes and hair on its hands and feet. But he said it was wearing a coat and a hat. My dad got scared and blew the big truck horn at it, and suddenly this guy, whatever he is, got down on all fours and ran off into the forest on all fours like an animal. He always claimed it was some sort of Bigfoot, but upon reflection, I believe he encountered a feral human, also known as a loup-garou in French culture. He rented a hotel room after that. This happened a few years ago. I've only told a few people, and I'm afraid everyone will think I'm crazy. I'd hiked this trail many times before. The trailhead is the only one. 5 miles out of town, and you have a cell signal the whole time. I spent the first mile up the mountain talking to my sister on the phone. I heard leaves crunching off the trail a few times, but with all the wildlife out there, I didn't think much of it and continued on with our talk. After we hung up, I took a quick break to catch my breath and grab a drink of water. I continued on for about 5 minutes, enjoying the quiet of the forest and the initial colors of the sun starting to set. I heard someone walking quickly a little ways down from the trail. I assumed it was someone at a switchback further down. As I turned to look, I see an all-black figure walking upright, like a human. My brain is trying to make sense of it. Could it be a super skinny bear walking on its hind legs? I continue to watch as it walks behind a tree, and I'm waiting for it to appear on the other side. But nothing. It disappears, and so does the sound of its footsteps. It's absolutely silent. I've never been so terrified in my entire life, and I immediately started looking around for some sort of weapon. The best I can find is a dried-out stick. That was the first time I started that trail and didn't finish, but I wanted nothing more than to be back in my car. It took me over 2 years to hike that trail again. Any thoughts on what it could be? I tried to research strange sightings in the area but didn't find anything. My siblings and I live in the pretty rural countryside with only 2 neighbors, one at the front of our house and one on the right side of it. To the left of our house, we have a lot of dense woods. Neither of our neighbors have children. It was late spring or early summer, and we had decided to play hide and seek in the woods, as we would do pretty commonly. We had been going for a few rounds, but it was my younger brother's turn to seek, so I and my sister decided to hide together. We crossed the creek and hopped over logs until we found a pretty wide tree to hide behind. We waited a few seconds, and we heard my brother say, "Ready or not, here I come." I motioned for her to stay quiet and get behind me so she could stay hidden. We sat there for minutes while I peeked around the side of the tree to watch my brother. At this point, I'm locked into the game, and I'm not paying attention. My sister nudges me, and it caught me pretty off guard, so I look over, and she's pointing at one of the trees near the abandoned shack behind us. I look to where she is pointing, and I see what appears to be a kid anywhere from 10 to 13 peering around the tree and looking towards us. The first thing I noticed was that he was wearing a green and white striped shirt. I looked at his face but saw nothing. His head was there, but he had no facial features. It's like a blank canvas. Quickly, I got up, pulled my sister along, and ran back towards the house. My brother was still looking for us, so as we passed, we just told him to run, and he did. We ran inside the house to tell our mom what we saw. She brushed it off in our imagination, but we insisted that we saw it. To this day, I don't know what it was, but my sister, who saw it first, is convinced that it had no face. I saw it only for a second, so what I saw could have been just my mind playing tricks, but I still wonder what it was and why it was just watching us. When I was about 7 or 8, I had a disturbing encounter with some kind of creature or entity. I lived in the Appalachian Mountains of Pennsylvania. It was November, around when daylight saving time occurred. I remember it was supposed to be a school day, but since the snow was so heavy, the buses were not able to drive out in the morning, so school was canceled for a snow day. I was so excited to spend the rest of the day outside in the snow. We had an acre of property, going quite far back into the woods. I was walking deep into the forest to find a small frozen pond beyond my property line. All of a sudden, the woods went dead silent. No birds, no wildlife scurrying around, absolutely nothing. I remember thinking it was strange, but I kept walking to make it to the pond. I should have turned around right then and there, but I was just a naive little kid. After I reached the pond, everything was still completely silent, and the hairs on the back of my neck felt like they were rising. I started to get frightened, but I didn't know why. I felt like something awful was going to happen to me if I didn't leave at that moment, so I decided to run back home. As I arrived at my backyard, I realized it was so late, and the sun was actually setting. My mom came running outside, asking where I was literally all day and to never ever disappear like that ever again. None of this made sense to me because I had only been outside for about 20 minutes. I left my house with my snow gear on at around 10 a.m., right after getting the snow day call. It was now almost 8 p.m., meaning I had been gone for around 10 hours. I have no idea what happened or how I had been gone for such a long period of time. I remember only being out there for such a short period of time. I don't know if this was a skinwalker encounter or even a Wendigo encounter. Has anyone else had this happen to them? Was it some kind of creature? I didn't see anything at all while out there. I didn't lose track of time, and I didn't fall and hit my head or anything. What do you think happened? Please let me know in the comments. Okay, so I have always believed in the supernatural but never really had any experience with it. I spend most of my time outdoors, deep in the backcountry, fishing. I am not scared of the woods or the critters. But today, something different happened. I was walking an old logging road that ran parallel to the creek. I started getting a strange feeling but didn't pay much attention to it. I walked to the water's edge and had a vision, like a mini dream that only lasted like 1.5 seconds, and I saw a man with a beard and a dark brimmed hat. I didn't actually see him, just a vision in my head of him. Afterwards, that strange feeling came back 10 times worse and got to the point that I just got up and left and constantly kept checking behind me. Once I got about 500 feet away from that spot, everything went back to normal. I can't stop thinking about it. Any thoughts on what it might have been? I came across my first encounter with something beyond explanation during a camping trip to Foster Falls a few weeks ago in South Cumberland State Park. My daughter, 13, and I decided to do a short camping overnight trip to a walk-in primitive site, about a 2.5-kilometer hike from the parking lot to the falls. Because it was the middle of the week, once we arrived at the small campground, unsurprisingly, I realized I was the only reservation out there. No biggie, we pitched the tent, ditched the bags, and had a great day swimming at the falls and an uneventful evening by the fire, but we hit the hay once the sun went down. The following morning, I woke up at dawn, and my daughter and I roamed the other campsites looking for some firewood. There was a path down to the group site, so while heading about 2 minutes down the path, the trail curved and straight ahead in the dense brush, we heard rustling, and whatever we stumbled across quickly noticed us too. It was just this massive white body as it took off. When we saw it, it made a high, whining goat-like shriek, like it was startled. But it was fast. Whatever it was had bone white flesh, or if it was fur or hair, it would have to be short and silky like. Clear as day was the sound of a loud clomping of hooves as it broke down the brush to get away from us. It then extended what looked like wings with no feathers, like white, large, extended bat wings. Neither one of us got a good look at the front of the body. It was hard to see, and like I said, it was not a clear view at all. But it seemed to lift off a little, but the entire time, we clearly heard what sounded like a horse running through the woods. Then, as quickly as it happened, it was gone. It just disappeared into the trees. It was so quick, and we were left dumbfounded that some huge white-winged thing that had hooves just charged through the forest. Just in a daze for a few seconds and like, did you see what I just saw? Look at one another, and then she said, was that a Pegasus? At that point, I knew I wasn't imagining things. Now, I wouldn't say exactly that it had the body of a horse. It seemed taller and not as wide. The body seemed more humanoid-like, but it was on all fours, at least for a moment, before we noticed the wings expanding. I never got a look at the front. I'm still trying to make sense of it all. I never felt like we were in any danger, but yeah, not staying after that. I didn't want to freak my daughter out, but I packed up and got the hell out of there. Has anyone encountered cryptid stories like this in Tennessee or in this neck of the woods with Appalachian lore? I feel silly even talking about this, but I know whatever it was, it did not match the description of a deer or anything I've ever seen. We're camping in the woods with our van. I decided to go for a walk when my wife wanted to stay in. It's 10 p.m., and I'm walking around a big lake in the forest. Once I'd gone around the bend, I heard a child crying, maybe 5 or 6 years old, from across the lake at a point that I'd just passed 5 minutes ago. A long, complaining cry, like a child who lost its parents. Not changing his tone, volume, or rhythm, just a long and dragging, complaining cry. Walking further for 15 minutes, I still hear the cry, in the same direction and at the same volume. It's following me, but from a large distance. What could it be? I know the different kinds of wildlife here, including the ones that mimic human screams, cries, and voices. But not like this. It's not monotone, there is some variation in its cry. It creeps me out. I'm definitely not going to the old ruins tonight. I live near a bunch of woods. Not exactly a rural area, but on the edge of a city that turns into woods. You have to cross a small abandoned railroad track over a small waterfall to get near the actual train tracks. I would walk down the tracks for a certain amount of time and just cut off into a random part of the woods. Walk a little and walk back. I'd walk hours out sometimes. I do this because I don't have friends and have grown really fond of nature. I won't say the location, but it is on the East Coast. After some time walking, I found what looked to be your typical walking path in the woods, so I strolled through there. I walked for about 15 minutes on the path and found a clearing in the woods with a staircase. Just some regular, mossy, stone steps. They were curved as well. It must have been about 15 feet high. But the weird part was that there was no foundation or anything. Maybe a piece of art? At this point, I was far from civilization. I didn't think anything of it, so I walked around it, checking it out, took some pictures, and climbed to the top of the steps for the view, but all I could see were trees. I wanted to mark the location, but I had no connection, so maps wouldn't open. It got boring after like 5 minutes, so I left back on the path. I thought I took the wrong way because it was about 15 minutes walking there from the track, but it took a little over an hour to get back. It horrified me because I thought I got lost, but after freaking out for 30 minutes, I was back on the tracks and went home. Nothing weird happened until I got home and looked at the pictures. But the stairs weren't in the pictures. Fear sets in because the pictures of what were supposed to be stairs were just wood. The stairs in the pictures were literally gone. I jumped on the internet to search for what they may have been built from, but couldn't find anything except articles. And that's when I got really scared. Nothing happened to me except me probably getting lost in the pictures, scary as it is. I did what I do best and tried to forget about it. This was a few weeks ago. I'm sharing this because, since then, I've slowly developed extreme anxiety and severe depression. Suicidal kind of depression. My girlfriends are on the verge of leaving me because I'm so angry at nothing. Short-tempered. I don't know what to do. I feel weird lately, almost like I'm in a dream. Everything's foggy and unrealistic. And I also get these episodes where I get hot, dizzy, and start to see black for a few seconds, but doctors chalk it up to anxiety. But that staircase hasn't left my mind since. Everything's getting worse. I'm not myself anymore. Can anyone explain what might be happening? I was walking around looking for places to camp on land between the lakes today. I've seen or heard weird stuff out there, but nothing as odd as this. I thought I saw something move in a thicket and saw what looked like a big bald eagle. The longer I looked at it, the more I thought it might be a person wearing a headdress. I saw it one more time further along the path, standing behind a snag, and it appeared to have a dark or black body, but the face or head was white. I was not close enough to see details, but the outline of the head looked similar to what a harpy eagle's head looks like. It could have been ears, for all I know. I had left my glasses at home by mistake. It never acted like it was going to follow me, it was just looking at me from two different places. I was walking, I felt a strange sensation as if I were being watched, but I ignored it, thinking it was something in my head. A week before the birth, I went outside to put the garbage. I put it on and looked to the side. An ugly creature was looking at me. It was like a wolf, but it couldn't be because he had gills that were red like blood. He and I were paralyzed for a few seconds when I blinked. He was barking and spitting at me. I ran as fast as possible without even looking when I got to the door, because the next thing is that the house has about 5 meters of grass from the house to the gate. I looked ahead. The animal ran. I tried to lock it, but it dashed toward the door. I ran up the stairs, but it followed behind. I locked myself in the room. Full of tears, I looked through the keyhole. The animal was prowling. I walked home. I sat on the bed and fell asleep. When I woke up, I saw the police. They were searching the whole house. I opened the door, and one of them came, asking what happened. When I explained, he looked surprised and said I had to be careful because there had been some attacks by wolves, but I knew the thing wasn't a wolf. In 2018, I was in college in the small town of Holland, Michigan. It's a small rural town 30 minutes away from Grand Rapids. The town barely has a downtown area consisting of one street. If you walk past the street, you'll eventually come to a small park called Window on the waterfront. Many people visit this park multiple times throughout the day, which is why it feels strange that I and my girlfriend were the only ones who saw something. Personally, I've gone to this park at extremely late hours because I was a bored college kid and never had a weird experience until my junior year. On a random Saturday, my girlfriend and I had the idea to walk through the park at sunset because the sky was beautiful and we wanted to get out of the house. We walked around the whole perimeter and sat in the open grass field for a little. Afterwards, we decided we should get something to eat and started to cut through the grass field to get into town sooner. Now, when we were walking back, the sun was still up. It looked more like dusk or twilight hours, but definitely enough sun to see clearly. In addition, this park and the town in general are not near any woods. In order to get to the woods, you have to go by car and drive a few minutes out, like 5 to 10 minutes or so. Halfway through the field, something strange emerged from the bushes. I remember it had pale white skin and was extremely thin, and even though it seemingly walked on all fours, it still looked pretty tall. At first, I thought it was a sick friend or something, but the closer we got, the stranger it looked. It started to look less animalistic and more humanoid because the head was somewhat shaped like a human. It did not look at us or even acknowledge us, it only crossed our path and disappeared into a little cove hidden between a few trees. Only after it disappeared did my girlfriend and I acknowledge what we just saw and how frightening our outcome could have been. Even so, we're the only ones in the area who have seen it, as the park was empty at this time. A few days later, we returned in broad daylight to see where it had possibly disappeared. To my surprise, I had forgotten that the park was near what I think may have been a sewage plant and saw a huge pipe on the side of the grassy mound between the trees. Maybe a drain for when the rains are too high. I'm not sure. What I am sure of is that thing hid in that pipe or may even live there. Seeing that creature made me question everything I thought I knew about the natural world. I didn't believe in cryptids or myths because I thought they were just made up or something said to scare kids. But if something like that exists, then honestly, so much more can too. I know it happened years ago, and I hate myself for not recording it or taking a picture. Maybe I was too scared. But those things are out there, I've seen them in plain daylight, and I'm hoping sharing my story can bring some clarity. To this day, I'm hoping I just saw a sick animal. The crawler drawings and stories I've read are the closest to describing what I saw. This summer, I went camping in the rural Nevada area. The area I was in has lots of Native American roots and history. This will be important later. My dad, my younger sister, and I decided to pack up early and hike down the mountain to go spend some time with our cousins, who lived in a small town nearby. Calling it a town is charitable. You know when you're on a road trip and you pass through a little area with a gas station and maybe a small, slightly outdated looking grocery store, and you wonder, who works there? There aren't any houses near, and it seems like something that was supposed to be attached to something bigger but was forgotten about. Well, this was the case for where my cousins lived. Down the road from the gas station and the Burger King, down another dirt road, and a few more turns, and soon you've found where all these people live. It's like a little secret neighborhood, but all the houses are separated by lots of land. It's rancher life out in this valley. Everybody is related in some way, either by blood, marriage, or an almost too close friendship. It's just a quiet corner of the world, and unless you know someone who lives there, you'll never even know it exists. Anyway, my cousins recently moved there into a lavish wood cabin. We stayed for 2 nights, and on the last night, something I think about often occurred. My cousins, my younger sister, and I had all finished playing a late-night game of cards. It was dark out, and most everyone else was in their rooms, sleeping. The only light that was on was the kitchen light, and moths swarmed the kitchen window and back door to try and access the light. We were all tired, so after we finished the game, we cleaned up, and I offered to take the cards out to the back porch. Since my cousins had just moved there, they hadn't unpacked everything, so they left their game boxes out on the back porch. I took the deck and stepped out of the sliding door, all on my own in the quiet nighttime. I bent down to try and rearrange the stack of games so I could make it nicer than I found it. My back was turned towards the thick brush and trees. Bugs were swarming around me and the dingy porch light. Strangely enough, I heard what I can only describe as a faint whistling. At first, I thought it was my dad, because the whistle was the exact same as the whistle my dad uses to let us know it's time to leave. For example, if we were at a dinner party, once it was time for our family to leave, my dad would do his signature whistle, and my siblings and I knew it was time to gather and leave. It's one of those things in life you never really acknowledge, something small that feels like you're the only one who notices it. Something mundane and unspoken yet comforting. I whipped my head toward the window beside me and saw nothing. My dad was asleep somewhere, I was sure of it. The whistling repeated itself 3 to 5 times more. I was less scared than I was confused. Still hunched over the box of games, I turned my head to the forest, just for a moment, and despite my curiosity, I knew that it was time to leave. Slightly ironic, isn't it? I walked inside and went to sleep. I didn't mention it to my cousins, I didn't want to scare them, and I still haven't said much about it even after we left the area. Whatever or whoever was whistling, so faintly that only someone who has heard that whistle before would recognize it, knew something so personal to me. I don't really believe in the supernatural or much folklore, but I often wonder why I heard that whistling that night and who was the one whistling. A part of me believes it is something along the lines of a skinwalker. That area, as I mentioned before, is land on which there are native reservations and a lot of native history and roots. I respect folklore, and in fact, I'm super interested in it. I love anything from slightly unnerving stories to downright horror tales, so I'm fairly well versed when it comes to skinwalkers, and a small part of me believes that the knowledge I have helped me to not call out or interact with the whistling in the woods. It is strange to me that a noise I've only ever heard from one person, whom I love dearly and am very familiar with, came from something that I will never know. I have always been a fairly spiritual person. I believe in the paranormal, and I believe that there are things that just must be explained by the paranormal. I also find myself intruded upon by the paranormal. I decided to go with my friend to find paranormal things around Pittsburgh. I have many stories to tell, but I'm going to tell this one. We used a pretty infamous app called Randonautica. It brought us to one random location. I can't remember what the intention was. When we arrived, it was one of the large parks. Our location was a little bit into the forest. I pick up a lot of spiritual energy from this area, so we go deeper to investigate. I stop and see a very strange looking tree and comment, "That is a strange looking tree." My friend responds, "That is not a tree." Spoiler alert. It was likely a flesh pedestrian. As we escaped from here as fast as we could, we ran back to our car and proceeded to watch lines and lines of cars pulling out of this building buried in this part of the forest. I was still having a really weird gut feeling about it, even with the protection spell we used. I felt off about that fleshy pedestrian, like it was particularly powerful. I have no reason to believe it was a cult, but it certainly felt very strange. Call me a clickbaiter. And it's safe to say we got the heck out of Dodge. This is a story that occurred back in 2018 when me and my family lived in Port Orchard, Washington State. I've always been a skeptic of the paranormal, but this story kind of changed my stance on it. To understand the story, you must visualize the layout of our house. Our house was located in a small clearing at the edge of Banner National Forest. We had a wraparound balcony with windows that fed into the kitchen, living room, and master bedroom, i.e., if you looked out any of those windows, you were looking directly onto the balcony. There was also a set of stairs that led onto the balcony from the lower patio near the basement. Lastly, our living room had a set of glass French doors in between the two windows. At the time, we only had one thin curtain covering the glass. Now that you can envision the layout, here's the encounter. It was the first 2 weeks staying there, and everyone went to bed around 10 to 11. At around 2 in the morning, my mom had woken up to the sound of scratching or footprints on the balcony right on the other side of the window. She peered back at the curtains on the window and saw nothing, but she kept hearing scampering sounds that got progressively faster and more aggressive. She then woke up my dad, and they both went into the living room to get a better view from the doors. My mom, afraid of what was out there, got down on her hands and knees and slowly peered back the curtain, only to be confronted with two sets of eyes looking directly at her. They didn't move, even when she screamed and jumped back. After about 5 minutes, they heard them calmly walk around the balcony and down the stairs. They convinced themselves it was just deer or something, since we do live in a national forest. When my mom told me about this the next morning, I remembered we had cameras that the previous owners had left, so I decided to take a look. What I saw was arguably one of the strangest things I have ever seen. 2 dogs, I think pit bulls, had come up onto the balcony. However, the way they moved was so unsettling, it was almost as if they didn't know how to walk on 4 legs, like they were used to being bipedal. They both stared into the glass at the same time, completely unfazed by all the noise my parents had just made. They remained there even after my parents went back to bed, just fixed on looking into the living room. Then, I kid you not, at the exact same time, they both turned their heads directly towards the camera in the corner, almost as if they knew someone would be watching it, and ran to the camera in complete sync with one another. I mean, they literally mimicked each other's movements so well that it was like a copy and paste of a video of the same dog running. I've never seen dogs act like that before. Even their eyes were eerie to look at, since they were staring right into the camera lens the entire time. Then they simply walked back down the stairs and into the woods. As far as I knew, both our neighbors didn't have pit bulls. I was left so creeped out by the footage. They seriously acted like animals in disguise, if that makes any sense. I kick myself every day for not taking that footage with me when we moved. I'm even unsettled about writing this story right now. Anyway, thanks for listening. In the winter of 2006, in central Canada, in my small town, I was making my way to school like any other day, but I arrived early and decided to walk near a forested area behind the school. It was then that I saw it as a jackrabbit, but with antlers, and before I heard anything about the Shope papillomavirus. The antlers on this beast were a beautiful set of antlers similar to those of a deer and did not resemble random horn growths like those of the said Shope papillomavirus. Anyway, back to the encounter. The antlered rabbit noticed me at this point and waited a few moments before it hopped away, and I did not lay chase. The distance between me and the rabbit would have been about 20 feet. I, being an innocent child, 8 to 9, at this time, didn't think anything strange about this encounter. It was comparable to seeing a regular rabbit. It wasn't until I brought up the encounter some days later with my father that he told me, "You saw a jackalope," and started laughing. That was when I learned of the jackalope concept. My grandfather was a soldier in the Soviet Union. He was stationed at a checkpoint near an airbase, somewhere near Serbia. The checkpoint was surrounded by woods. There was only one road that went to the checkpoint and to the airbase. Sometimes when he rode down the road to the checkpoint, he would find dead animals, like at least 3 to 4, sometimes 5 or 6, but one day he was riding down the road with a car. There were 4 guys in the car, one of whom was my granddad. He spotted a bloody deer or moose, and upon seeing it, he pressed the brake pedal with such force that one of the men in the back flew into the front. My granddad told me that the moose looked like it was scared, as it was breathing really fast, like it was running for a long time, and looking everywhere. My granddad told me that he and one other guy got out of the car and tried to scare it away. When they got closer, what they saw was what looked like deep claw marks on the bone. As they tried to scare it away, they heard what sounded like something running in the woods, you know, when the woods have a lot of branches on the ground and they break. The woods went from sound to no sound. As he said, the only thing that my granddad heard was the breathing of the moose and the branches that were breaking in the woods. There were a good 30 to 40 meters between the road and the woods. Now, the two of them, my granddad and the other guy, were standing out there without moving, scanning the wood line. Then one of the other guys in the car came out and asked why they were both standing still. When the third guy saw something running in the woods, he was frozen in one spot, took out a flashlight, and was scanning the woods with it. My granddad was quiet for 2 minutes with a blank face and eyes wide open until he started to talk again. He said that when the third guy's flashlight crossed a small opening in the woods, he saw a figure standing tall. In the opening, 3 or 4 seconds later, it just bolted to the left into the woods. When the tall figure bolted to the left, Granddad and the second guy ran to the car, grabbed their rifles, and ran next to the third guy, who was still scanning the wood. My grandpa told me that when they heard a screech to the left side of the road, the fourth guy came out of the car screaming, "What the duck is on the road?" When the fourth guy was screaming, the other 2 guys and my granddad turned straight to the road and saw what was a tall grayish-blackish color. The car on the road was still on, so the headlights were pointed to the road. The only thing that they saw in color was the feet of the figure. They couldn't see the top of it because it was too dark to see the top half. My granddad said the guy who was screaming took out a handgun and shot 3 to 5 rounds at the tall figure. It screeched and ran from the other side of the road towards the woods. My granddad said that he and the other guy with the rifles ran to the car and got in. The guy with the flashlight ran and grabbed the guy, screaming. The tall thing pushed him into the car and then got in. Then my granddad put it in drive and speeded off to the checkpoint, some 30 to 20 kilometers away. He said it was the only thing that made him scared for his life, and he and the other 3 guys agreed to never speak of it to anyone in the army. This happened to me about a number of years ago, and I have never forgotten. One night, as I was lying in bed, trying to get some sleep, my black cat Sabrina scratched at my bedroom door to be let out. Tired but mostly awake, I slipped out of bed, shuffled to my door, and let her go out. However, she looked at me and guided me to the side door to go outside. I went to the door and opened it, then pushed the screen door out of the way so she could leave. However, after I closed the screen door, I happened to look out across the way, which happens to be the side of the neighbor's house. In the driveway, blocking a bit of their house, is my dad's 1995 Chevy truck. On the other side of my dad's truck, I saw a strange figure standing by the hood. I could only see its shoulders and up. It had a larger head than its body, according to what I could see. Its neck was thin, and its shoulders were bony looking. Whatever it was had 2 large, empty eye sockets where eyes should be but weren't. They were pitch black, like 2 voids against the pale skin. Now, the rest of the face I could never forget. It looked like the upper half of its face was covered in skin, and the lower it went towards its jaws. It looked shredded up. Where the jaw was located was complete bone, and it had a wide, toothy grin as it just stood there and seemed to be looking right at me. Mind you, I wore glasses to see distances, and I thought maybe I was seeing some kind of blur of the bushes or something from the neighbor's house, so I squinted my eyes to get a better look. It made it worse. I saw even more details of the creature than I did before squinting. Everything about its appearance became more clear and detailed. The texture of the skin, the wrinkles, and the bits of torn up looking flesh. There was no mistaking what I saw now. Terrified, I closed the side door and locked it. I was breathing heavily. Even then, I tried to reason with myself that maybe what I saw wasn't real. But I couldn't shake it. I know what I saw. Still scared, I ran into my room and jumped into bed. I was in my 30s, yet I took my blankets and hid under the covers like a child. After all these years, I suddenly felt the way I used to feel as a child when I woke up to vivid night terrors. That fear of not being able to escape the horrors of my imagination. I felt completely alone and vulnerable, even though my parents were across the way in their bedroom. As I hid under the blankets, I suddenly heard long, continuous scratches on my wall by where the creature was seen. It was like it was in my room, and I was running a nail along my bumpy bedroom wall. I could hear the nail lightly thump each time it hit them. My panic grew, and I felt more and more at the mercy of childhood trauma. I started to cry and tried to talk myself out of this fear that gripped me. Maybe this thing fueled fear. I thought to myself. Maybe it was getting a rise out of me and using my fear for its enjoyment? I tried to calm down and tell myself that everything was okay. As I was starting to relax, the scratching finally stopped, and everything went quiet. After all I had been through and seen, I continued to try and convince myself that I was still seeing things. The next night, as the cat wanted to go outside again, I reluctantly looked in the location where the creature had stood behind the hood of my dad's truck. Nothing in the area looked like a creature at all. Not even any of the features. That's when I settled with myself that what I saw was real, and that realization scared me all the more. I never want to see that thing again, and I hope it never comes back. My parents owned property on quite a few acres, surrounded by state land and backed up by farm land. Most are heavily wooded, with a small swamp towards the road and a large hill or field with massive power lines trailing through the back. It is very secluded, the type of place you can't get decent internet or service at. Their house sits at the back of their property, probably around 650 to 800 back from the road, with dense woods in between. You can't see any neighboring houses or the road from their house. It is absolutely magnificent, although terrifying sometimes. We moved there in 2007, but only recently, within the last year or so, have strange things been happening. Initially moving in, the place was unfinished, so my family immediately started adding in decks and patios, landscaping features, interior construction, etc., so this place is no stranger to changes being made. I've directly experienced some things, and some are what my parents have started opening up about. Most recently, there has been the mystery of the missing light bulbs. One night, 3 little light bulbs from their deck railing lighting disappeared. The kind that sits just under the railing, so like 3 from ground level. They are the little ones that snap in and out, but they have filament and are glass bulbs. Completely gone, without a trace. A few weeks later, the same thing happened with a light underneath that same deck that sits about 6 up from ground level and happens to be right outside of my old bedroom with a window that directly looks out at it. I investigated this myself the next morning after the night. It went missing after coming by for a cookout. No glass shards were on the ground. The base of the bulb wasn't still in the fixture, as if it had been smashed or exploded. Just completely gone. I checked the surrounding areas and bushes nearby, walked the yard, and found nothing. By far the weirdest recent occurrence is their outdoor plug-in timer. This happened the same night as the first 3 missing light bulbs. They had a plug-in timer that you plug a light into on their front porch by their front door on the opposite side of the house that turned on at dusk and stayed on until morning. This timer resembles a small box container that has a clasp and flap that you open and swing upwards to get to the inside to set your times. This timer was still plugged into the wall, but completely dismembered. Swung open, but the gears were each methodically pulled out and carefully placed around it separately on the ground around it. It was as if someone was taking it apart with the intention of engineering it back together again. Every piece was placed neatly on the ground in front of it, but its case was never removed from the outlet. Not torn apart. No claw marks or chew marks, not smashed. Just very neatly taken apart. And no, they didn't take a picture of it. I know I was upset too. After that, I recommend they use their trail cam to see if they can see who or what is coming up to their home at night, but when they point it at one side of the house, something happens on the opposite side, and it's infrequent. My parents also told me about last summer, when I started to see things moving in the woods at night and sometimes during the day. They each see slightly different things, but they are kind of similar. They both have admitted seeing something moving through the woods that has a full glow. One said it was more of a low, ambiguous shape, and the other said it was a more defined figure, but both said it looked like it was glowing. Strange moving colored lights one night, an odd almost mist or fog that seemed to move with purpose another night. During the daylight, I see a particular olive bush vibrating at the top of the hill, where the power lines are out of their peripherals, but when directly looked at, it stays perfectly still. I realize some things must be a trick of the eye, or maybe energy coming from the power lines, but the missing light bulbs and dismembered timer? Anyone have any idea what could be happening? I'm curious to see if anyone has had similar experiences or has a theory. This story happened when I was 9 years old. It was a day late in July, and my cousin and I were playing in the woods, building forts, and just messing around. Their house was surrounded by woods, and their house was in a field with power lines behind it. Anyway, we were collecting sticks to build a fort. We found quite a few sticks and eventually split up to grab some more. I headed towards where the woods ended and the power line started. As I was grabbing sticks, I noticed a tall white figure standing behind one of the power lines. It was just standing there, watching me. It appeared to be about 7 feet tall and very slender. I wasn't sure if I was just seeing things, so I got my cousin, and he saw it too. It wasn't wearing any clothes, but it lacked any human-like features like eyes or a mouth. It was just a person-like figure, but what was most odd was that it was pure white. It wasn't glowing or just really pale. It looked like the absence of darkness, but it wasn't glowing. It's difficult to explain how it looked. We, of course, sprinted back to the house as quickly as we could. After we returned to the house, we discussed whether we really saw what we had just seen. We didn't go in the woods for weeks after that and haven't seen it in over 5 years. I recently went back to my cousin's house, and we decided to play hide and seek in the dark. We were playing in the basement and turned all of the lights off. My cousin was the first to seek, so me and the other players hid. I took a hiding spot by the window. After about 5 minutes of hiding, I was the last to be found. As I was about to get up and look for them, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. I turned around, and the white shadow was pressed up against the glass. I saw no features but could see where its eyes, mouth, and nose should be. I quickly got my cousin and told him what I saw. He gave me a shocked look and looked out the window. It was still there. We ran up the stairs as quickly as we could. Then later in the night, as we were going to sleep, I saw something out of the corner of my eye again. My cousin was already asleep, so I just pressed my eyes closed and tried to ignore it. I could sense that it was still in the room, and then all of a sudden it was gone. I opened my eyes, and it was gone. I haven't seen it since then. So I'm about 13 to 14 at the time, and it's summertime, and during the summer, me and my friends love to go on the trails at the nature preserve at night because it's quite creepy and we love adrenaline. Now most of the trails are quite short, but one of them is 2.5 miles long and goes through about half of the entire nature preserve. We've been scared to go down this trail at night, but this time we finally decided to face our fears and go for it. So we go down the trail, and the trail is this gravel road, and it's quite wide, so we are all next to each other on our bikes, and it's about 6 of us. Now the trail is completely surrounded by woods, and there is no light. To make it extra creepy, we decided not to use any flashlights, which was a terrible idea, and you'll see why later on in the story. So we're going down this trail, and out of nowhere, we see about 8 deer in the middle of the trail just standing still. Now, for some reason, my friend has a fear of deer, and he's like panicking and trying to go back, but we didn't want to let him go by himself, and we also didn't want to leave the trail, so we kind of forced him to stay. Out of nowhere, the deer start running into the woods as if they were startled by a potential predator. And you know how, when you're in the woods, you hear all the crickets, frogs, etc. They all went quiet, so it goes to complete utter silence, and we're all freaked out standing in the middle of the trail, expecting a bear or something to pop out. We stay in the spot for about a minute or two until all the sounds come back and everything seems to be normal. Now, I don't know why, but even after that, we still had the will to keep going down the trail. So we go down the trail, and out of nowhere, the trail gets very narrow, like about 5 feet wide, and we didn't realize it, so we all just go straight into the woods off the trail and eat shit. It took a little bit to recuperate, but we got into a straight line and went down the narrow trail. At this point, the trail went from a gravel road to just a small, narrow dirt path. The following moments are by far the scariest moments of my life. We're going down the narrow path, and I randomly look to my right and notice a bit of light. I notice we are next to a road in the distance, meaning we are nearing the end of the trail. Now I'm looking at this road, and I'm not paying attention to what's in front of me. I ran straight into the person in front of me, and it was like a domino effect. We all fell down. Now as I'm getting back up, I start to hear the sound of wood knocking all around me, and we all hear it, and we say, WTF? And then we hear people talking. You know what it sounds like to be in a room full of people talking, so you hear people talking but can't really make out what they're saying? That's what it was. And then the voices stopped, and we noticed a silhouette on the road in the distance just standing and looking right at us, and we took this as a sign to turn around and leave. And we raced back. And as we're riding back as fast as we can, my bike chain breaks. So we stop and fix it as fast as we can, and as we're fixing it, the woods go quiet again, and I hear extremely heavy footsteps, and we book it the duck out of there. And as we exit the trail and get back on the road that my neighborhood is on, we hear what sounded like a woman's screech come from the trail, and we race home and never go back to that trail again. So when I was younger, I lived near a native reservation of the Tulalip people on the north side of the Seattle area up here in Washington state. The cool part was hearing the stories about all the spirits and animals and stuff and learning about this sort of shit from the elders of the tribe. What did spook me was how some spirits can seem nice but really have bad intentions, like the crow or fox. So when I was about 7 or so, I went into the local woods to hang out and play with friends. We did this all the time, as the closet park was really shitty and our parents would rather we play in the woods than in the rusty and gross park. So while playing one day, I got this really weird feeling like something was always just behind me. I would turn around, and this feeling would move to always be behind me. No matter how fast I moved, being 7 I was immediately spooked, and then on top of that, knowing about bad spirits, I was like, oh no, I am going to be eaten or turned into a tree. I obviously wasn't. Mind you, I wasn't lost. My friends were all right next to me but were not reacting at all. I didn't know what to do, so we kept on playing and doing dumb stuff like sword fighting and fort building. Eventually we had to head back, and it was then that I noticed that the whole day we didn't hear anything. No birds, animals, or even bugs. I also realized that I didn't know where we were but got back safely somehow. It felt as though we had ventured into a transitional area. When we got back, we all kind of just forgot about that day. It was as if it hadn't really happened. It wasn't until I got in contact with some old friends from then that they told me how they felt the same way. Something was always just standing behind us, watching. I don't know if it was spirits, my dumb 7-year-old brain, or the fact that I was already spooked by the story's events, but to this day, I have always been wary whenever I go into the woods alone and never go at night. Not really a warning thing, but if you do camp up here in Washington state, just be aware that we have something older than man. One of my major hobbies is hunting and fishing, and I love to do it, but there have been several times where I have gone hunting and seen some strange occurrences. The one I remember most and that still freaks me out today is where I saw something that made me freeze in place. I just turned 16 and lived in Crown Point, Indiana, by a whole bunch of woods a mile from our house. I decided to go out hunting when I got off work since it was opening day. It was a slow day when I went out, which I wasn't surprised since any time I went out later in the day I wouldn't see any deer, but I had a feeling that I might since it was getting darker. I sat for another 2 hours, and I was about to leave since the sun was setting and I didn't want to get lost back in my car since it would probably be pitch black by the time I got there. So I was about to get my gun hanging from a rope above my stand on a branch when I noticed something peculiar. I sat back in the stand and stared at this light bouncing up and down through the woods, and then I started going at full speed to the right of me. At first, I thought it might be a tracker on a deer since some people might put trackers on deer that they feed so that when they get big, they shoot them. Anyway, it startled me, but then I just figured that out, so I just continued getting my gun down. When I finished and went to walk down the stand, I almost fell completely. The light was brighter, so I knew it was closer, and it was running and bouncing to the right of me. It got as close as 4 yards, and I knew it wasn't a deer because there was no noise whatsoever. I finally just looked in front of me and actually ran at full speed. When I got to my car, I was still in a daze and drove home. I didn't really say anything because many people wouldn't probably believe me, and many of you probably won't, but this was my second most scary experience. There was another one I had in a hotel in Chicago called the Congress, where a faucet turned on and really got me to believe in ghosts. I will tell you, I barely believed in ghosts and thought it was just an explanation for most things, but I can't find one. This was not a lightning bug either, because it was the size of my fist. I just wanted to finally tell a whole bunch of people and see if they had experienced anything like this. My husband and I were honeymooning, driving our camping rig on overland and dirt roads from ghost town to ghost town. We'd pick a town and camp near it for the night, and we'd been doing that for about a week. Nothing special or creepy happened at any point, just some nature and some history. One town I was very excited about was Garnett, Montana. It's just about an hour from Missoula, and we'd called our friend, who's an outfitter in Billings, for a place to camp. He said that just up the mountain, there are flat spots. Now we have a 17-year-old Toyota with big tires, a rooftop tent, and sleeping quarters in the cabin because we always travel with our 2 dogs and cat, so all we need is a decent spot, slightly hidden, and we're good. As we drive up the back side of the mountain, off the main road, I see abandoned cars and a few rundown houses. Nothing's too weird, but I can't shake the pit in my stomach that's growing. We get further up and past the parking area for the ghost town, and the higher we drive, the more my instinctive anxiety kicks in, the flight of a fight or flight. Adding to that, my dogs are going nuts. Of course, I wrote it off as them needing to get out. So we finally find a flat spot, and I realize my husband and I hadn't spoken the whole drive up, probably 45 minutes. He goes to get out of the car to see if it's level, and I grab his hand, dogs barking, whining, and pacing, and say, "Please don't turn the lights off." I think I saw eyes before we stopped. He just looks at me confused and says why he has to, but he'll leave the cabin lights on. When he gets out, all I can think about is how he's watching. I don't even know what it is, but I sensed it followed us from where the eyes flashed. When he gets back in, I tell him not to let the dogs out yet, and he just says, "We just should go. Something isn't right." Now, we camp a lot, and I get spooked, but my husband never does. We usually hang out, and I relax, and it's fine. He's never left a spot because I've been alarmed. So when he said we should go, I knew he felt it too. We head down a different road, the paved one to I-90, driving fast. I looked in the rear view mirror, but the dogs were in the way, and the tint is so dark that you can't see well at night, but there was a rumble like something big was running. The tension is growing, the dogs are pacing, and he and I are bickering, and it starts snowing hard out of nowhere. We come around a turn, and a stark white rabbit dashes in front of the car, and we hit it. A hush fell over all of us after that until we got down the mountain onto a side road. All the anxiety we felt was gone. Cut to the other side of Missoula, where we camp. There's no creepiness until the next day. As we're driving back to Garnet on the main mountain road we came out on, we notice a point when we ascend the mountain where we both start feeling nervous. I looked at my husband after we made the big turn and said, "Where's the rabbit?" It was gone. No carcass, no blood, no animal tracks, no trace, it had been there. I can believe that something got it, but there is no trace of it. We were the first people up, no other tire tracks besides ours on the way down, and I would think you'd see blood or something, but it was gone. The snow wasn't deep enough to have buried it because we could see our distinct tracks from the previous night. No rabbit. So we get to the ghost town, so interesting, by the way, and we're talking to the rangers about the creepiness on the mountain, and one of the guys says, "Yeah, there's something up here. I wouldn't stay by myself at night." And the other smiles and says, "What exactly did you see and feel?" So I tell him I felt a deep, primal fear that it was old, not human, and hadn't been human for a while, if ever. I said it wasn't a ghost, and it wasn't a living crazy person. I said I felt like it wanted to eat me, which I know is strange, but I felt like we were being hunted. And I said at one point, I thought I saw its red eyes, but I couldn't be sure, and I think it followed us from where I'd seen the eyes, like stalking. He says, "There's a Wendigo up here. Do you know what that is?" I didn't, but when he described the lore, I almost cried. That was it, exactly. Down to the eyes. A few months later, I'm telling this story to my stepmother, who's been researching American Indian symbolism, and she says, "You know what rabbits are, right?" Of course, I do not. Rabbits are often believed to be warrior spirits, and they say that when the rabbit comes, he's fighting for you. That rabbit sacrificed himself for you guys that night. A chill ran over me, and my husband looked at me and said, after the rabbit, it stopped chasing us. I hadn't mentioned that I thought it chased us. This is something that happened to me and a group of friends in 2007 in Caroline County, Virginia, which is a rural area approximately 45 minutes north of Richmond, Virginia. I, then 18, would often hang out with my best friend, 21, at his house, which was quite close to some thick woods. We would often go out and explore them at night. We'd always get a strange feeling there, and it was an oddly quiet place. One day, we're hanging out, and he mentions he saw some strange signs in the woods, lots of them. He shows me, and they say buffer zone, spaced evenly apart, every 10 feet or so. The signs mention not to enter, but we were teenagers, so that night we donned camouflage and creep past the signs. Joker, Hydro, and Viper, sorry, I only remember their nicknames and we are no longer in touch, of our discovery, and that night, we lead them deep into the woods to where we were before. They are creeped out, but don't back out since they knew they'd never hear the end of it if they did. The general feeling of the woods that night was electrified, like the feeling you get in the midst of a tornado or approaching hurricane. The exhilaration of danger and the unpredictability of a force with which you cannot compete. The 5 of us retreated to a small circular clearing about 20 feet from the edge of the tree line after somebody voiced their concern about being spotted. We were sitting there discussing what the purpose of the complex could be when we heard crashing noises. Loud ones. The best way I can describe it is the sound mechas make when stomping through trees in anime, and the forest floor shook as it happened. The sounds were rare at first, maybe every 10 to 15 minutes. We were freaked out but more curious than anything, so we waited. The woods were generally silent, but we began hearing rustling in the thick woods, rather close to us, about this same time. I personally had many months under my belt of camping in the wildest parts of North America from my earlier teen years, and I did not believe this to be an animal. At one point, as the strange noises paused, bringing the forest back to its eerie silence, the rustling of this person became so close that we should have seen them right on the edge of the clearing, but nothing was there. We felt a presence, we felt watched, and we had all fallen as silent as the woods around us, staring at the empty space where a person should have stood. The loud noises started up again at this point, but more frequently, and now they came from not one direction but three or more. Some were closer, and some were farther off. At this point, we were sufficiently terrified that we'd stumbled onto some sort of testing site and made our way quickly back to Richard's house. Once we made it past the signage, the noise suddenly ceased. It was as if whatever made them had done it just to run us off, but if it was meant to deter us from future exploration, it failed. We made many trips into this area of the woods over several months, and strange things happened often. The loud mecha-like noises were most frequent. However, I will skip ahead to one of the last times we ventured into this area, as it was the most extreme. I am going to tell it as best I can, as we all have missed time and memories of that long night. However, Richard and I remembered more than the others. I want to make it clear that we were all sober this night. You'll understand why this statement is important later. All 5 of us were there. It was approximately 11 p.m. when we entered the woods. We did not go our typical route along the tree line of the large clearing. Instead, we decided to explore deeper into the woods, to the right of our usual spot, which would mean we were walking parallel to the single-lane, dirt road entrance to the facility. While unintentional, as we had intended to explore the woods themselves, we eventually made it to where we could see a sort of guard station quite a ways down this dirt road. It was brick, fairly small, with a gate across the dirt road and a tank facing towards incoming traffic on the opposite side of the road. The station did not appear to be manned from a distance, but we didn't want to get too close as we were clearly not supposed to be there and nobody wanted to get shot. We then returned into the forest and ventured on, praying we hadn't been seen. Here is where my memory blurs. The next thing I remember is coming across a runway of sorts, paved, in a huge, cleared area. It was such a large clearing that it seemed impossible for it to fit inside these woods. We exited the woods and walked towards the runway, none of us speaking a word, as if in a trance. We then observed an aircraft hovering 15 feet in the air or so, maybe 20 yards in front of us. The buzzing hum was nearly deafening, and the bluish-white lights were blinding. The lights grew brighter still, and the hum was even louder. After that, I only recall small frames of memory. I remember a blindingly white room. I remember beings I could not see conversing with me via thought alone. I remember Richard being there too, although I could not see him. I remember lying down, unable to see anything but blinding white. I could only stare up at where the ceiling should be. I could not move my eyes or my body, but I was somehow content, regardless of this. The next thing I remember is that we were exiting the woods from the same place we always entered. The sun was just barely beginning to rise. We spent a long time talking about this experience amongst one another. Richard remembered finding the runway, the aircraft, and the white room, but nothing more. Our 3 friends, for the most part, were simply frightened and confused, as we had all lost about 6 hours and they remembered nothing. All 5 of our memories pick up again at the edge of the woods, walking back to Richard's house around 6 a.m. I'm not saying the government is experimenting with interdimensional beings or aliens, but it is the only explanation that makes sense to me. 2 years ago, I went to visit my grandparents' place for the first time in years. It's a small town, and the house is located on a hill that extends to an open landscape. Anyway, it was night, and everyone was either in the kitchen or bedroom watching TV. I had to go to the bathroom. They only have one bathroom, and it's outdoors, so I made my way over, taking my phone. I saw the neighbor's black dog that comes during the day to play with us and my grandparents' dog. Except it was weird for it to be outside at night. The whole property is surrounded by a concrete wall that has a tall, pointy metal fence on top of it. The only 2 gates accessible close or are locked at sunset. So there was no way it could have entered since my grandparents and my visiting family all made sure to put all the animals in their place before locking the gates. Doors are always closed unless a visitor comes or to let my grandparents' dog go play on the open land outside the property with the neighbor's dog. There were no visitors that day. Back to the story, I start making my way to the bathroom, and the dog appears from behind the bathroom building. It was wagging its tail and making those excited, low-pitching noises that dogs make when they are happy to see their owners. And I start walking towards it, and I see that it gets all excited and comes towards me, and I'm petting it. Nothing was out of the ordinary. I just remember thinking how nice it was that this dog came play with my grandparents' dog. Then suddenly it starts walking away from me, back to behind the bathroom. So I go after it, thinking I'll call the neighbors and tell them if they want to come pick up their dog or if they'll come pick it up in the morning. Their house is close to the bottom of the hill, about a 15-minute walk. I wasn't about to walk alone in this town, I don't know. Halfway through it, I get this weird feeling and stop. I see it standing there just staring at me, and being my dumb self, I take a few steps towards it, extending my hand and calling out its name, Blackie. But the dog starts backing away slowly, not letting go of eye contact. Which sent a red flag immediately because the way it stepped back and wouldn't look away from my eyes creeped me out. It slowly stepped back into the dark, so I turned my phone flashlight on and scanned the light around. I couldn't see it, it had gone so fast, too fast. I was going to go after it because, apparently, I have no common sense. But just as I started walking forward, I heard this weird bark, followed by one long howl. It was not exactly dog-like, because I've grown up with all kinds of dogs growing up, and that's not how dogs sound. It sounded wrong. I thought maybe it had hurt. So I ended up calling my dad to come search for it. We scanned every inch of the property, but no dog. Both gates were locked. I got really creeped out after that, couldn't sleep well, and kept hearing that weird howl all night. We checked in with the neighbors the next morning, and apparently their dog was with them the whole time. I seriously don't like my grandparents' place at night, it's creepy as heck. The whole town is surrounded by creepy stories. Even my dad has had weird encounters with weird cloaked people and strange lights where they shouldn't be. This year, I have to make the trip back. I'm kind of terrified. So today, my cousin and I were both out cutting down trees to allow some more sunlight to get into our garden. It was dark outside, but still bright enough to cut down another tree or two. While I was about to swing the axe, I saw multiple white dots of light shining through the trees, and then a few of them disappeared, but 3 of them still stayed there. While we were trying to walk towards the dots of light, we took a few steps forward, and then my cousin and I both started hallucinating houses, and the houses we were seeing we could both describe to the smallest detail to each other, and they got more and more distinct the more we stared at them. I looked to my far left and then saw a massive log cabin, and when he looked, he saw it too, and we could both describe it perfectly. He and I both felt like we were in a dream the entire time and felt very drawn towards the houses we saw, but we didn't feel scared at all. In fact, we got an eerie sense of comfort from these houses, which was super weird. We decided to come inside and just not talk about it, and now we are both playing Call of Duty in his room. An important thing to add is that we live in the middle of the woods in Virginia, and we have lived here for 6 years. We have been through every inch of those woods, and we know for a fact that there aren't any houses anywhere close to the woods where we were seeing the houses. We double-checked on maps, and there was absolutely nothing. I was camping with my wife in some sand dunes about 30 minutes east of Roswell, New Mexico. We had struggled all day and afternoon to find a spot to camp or even a hotel because this was during peak COVID times and everything was shut down. So we ended up getting there pretty late at night. It was gorgeous, pitch black, no lights. It was the first time I had ever seen the Milky Way with my bare eyes. The layout of the campsite was simple. It was a straight dirt road from the entrance that led to a dead end, and every few yards along the left and right side of the main road you could turn off and it would dead end to another camping spot. We took the first left, and at the end of the path, there were already some folks camped out in an RV and grilling, so we turned around and just took the straight shot all the way to the end of the main dirt road. We set up camp and made dinner, then cracked open some beers and put on a movie on my laptop. About halfway through the movie, my wife pauses it and asks, "Did you hear that?" It sounded like footsteps. We had the rain fly off tent so we could just look right out, and I looked around with a flashlight and didn't see anything, so we continued on with the movie. We figured maybe it was some dune animal, as we had seen rabbit and perhaps deer tracks around a large sand dune that our tent was set up beside. We finished the first movie, then put on another. At the end of the second movie, I heard some odd whining noise. I paused the movie, and my wife said, "I think that was just the movie." And I pressed play, and immediately we both heard the noise again, but louder. We paused it, and we heard what sounded exactly like the noise our cat back home makes when he's whining, only much louder and deeper. I'd never heard anything like it before, and I've heard all sorts of big cat calls. Something was just wrong about it, like it was a noise something pretending to mimic a cat would make. It sounded maybe 10 feet away, and it just kept on crying. So my wife and I both decide we should probably hop in the car and turn on the lights, maybe honk the horn if we see anything, and spook it off. We get in the car, turn on the lights, and nothing. Nothing's there. So we sit for a bit and search what sort of big cats are in New Mexico. It turns out there's bobcats, mountain lions, and Canadian lynx. So we YouTubed audio clips of all of them to try to identify which one it could be. For 45 minutes, we went through clip after clip, and nothing sounded like what we heard. We thought momentarily that maybe one of the campers we had come across earlier was playing a trick on us. Maybe our movie was too loud? Maybe they were annoyed by us pulling up to their camp earlier in the night. That thought was almost more eerie, as it was so dark out, they would have had to have creeped around in the pitch black just to stalk us and then hide. We were too creeped out and figured we'd pack it in and maybe find a late night motel or sleep in the car. So we dash out to the camp and break down the tent, and as we do so, I spot something odd. In the sand, there were massive circular indents, 2 at a time, like something bipedal, almost like footprints or tracks, but with no markings underneath. As if something massive has just forced the sand down. It came from behind the dune next to our tent and stopped right up to the spot where my wife had thought she heard footsteps earlier in the night. There was only one set of tracks leading away from the tent. Something walked right up, then disappeared. I put my foot inside the indent to get an idea of its size. I was wearing my size 12 Doc Martens, and it was a few inches bigger on all sides than my boot. Abruptly, in the dunes further away from the camp, we heard a massive bwoo-oon. Bwoo-oon. Like a semi, it sounded like the horn of a semi-truck, only in the middle of. We gathered our trash by the armful, threw it in the car, and promptly departed. Remember how I said the trail was a single main road with smaller paths that branched off it? Not anymore. Heading back, we were taking turns left and right. The main path was now winding and confusing, and none of our electronic map programs were working anymore. After what felt like 20 to 30 minutes of driving, we were suddenly back on the highway. It was 3:30 to 4 a.m., and we drove straight back to Colorado and didn't stop until we passed the state line. To this day, we both refuse to stop overnight or camp in NM. I promise this is a true story. No one seems to believe me, but I can't explain it otherwise. I was out camping in the mountains when I was about 11 years old. It was this small open area deep in the forest, surrounded by trees. It was a family trip that included my sister, parents, grandparents, and cousins, as well as a few friends and their parents. So it was 2 tents and 1 RV. My family slept in one tent that had a side connected to the tent my dog slept in, with a toilet tent nearby. My friends and their parents had a tent behind ours, while my grandparents and cousins slept in the RV. There were 12 of us in total, including me. Other than us, there was only one other RV that also had a dog and another tent with a few rows down. It was a fairly big campsite, so there was a lot of distance between us, and my family was closest to the woods, not so close that we could see into it, but close enough that we could see about 5 feet past the tree line. It was a 2-week trip, and we had 5 days left before going home. It was about 3 a.m., and I was still awake. I had forgotten my insomnia medicine at home and had slept till 2 that afternoon. I had to use the bathroom but was too scared to go out alone, so I woke my dad up. He didn't want to leave the tent but promised to watch from the windows until I came back inside. So, I grabbed a lamp and went outside to the toilet tent. Once inside, I closed myself in and turned off my lamp, a habit I have so that bugs aren't attracted to the lamp inside the tent and so no one can see me in there. It wasn't even a minute later that the dogs, who were in the tent next to the bathroom, started barking and growling like nuts. Now these 2 never barked or growled except when someone came too close to the tent or that one time geese were passing between the tents and it scared them. And it was late, and I could hear no one outside. My dad started yelling for them to shut up, but they just got louder, and our golden retriever, who couldn't hurt a fly, started to bark this scary bark. Our other dog was growling like he was about to attack something. It was scary to hear. I was scared and wanted to know if there was something outside I needed to yell for my dad about. So I opened up the entrance just slightly to see what was out there. I looked straight out into the woods, trying to see if it was another animal, but couldn't see anything. But then, just to the left of where I was looking, something moved behind the trees. Once my eyes focused on it, I could see this large figure, much bigger than what a human would be at this distance, walking across the tree line, not coming into the camp but walking past it. Its arms looked like they were dragging on the ground, and it looked like it had this long snout coming from its face. Its eyes were reflecting the light from the RV across the way, making its eyes glow a scary red color. It also looked to have these huge antlers on its head and moved in an almost smooth way. As smooth as it looks unnatural and like it was kind of floating there. Finally, my dad started shouting for the dogs to shut up and open the side of the tent that connected to the dog's tent, causing the dogs to run into the main tent. The creature seemed to not react to the commotion but did turn to walk back into the woods, away from our area. As it moved away, the dogs started calming down and stopped barking and growling like nothing happened. It took me 5 minutes after seeing the dog leave to feel my heart beating. My dad called to ask if I was okay, and I said yes and went back inside, but I couldn't sleep at all that night. In the morning, during breakfast, I told everyone what I had eaten, but no one believed me. My papa said I probably was seeing things from how tired I was or was seeing a deer in the dark and just missed how it looked. After breakfast, me and the kids my age, aka all the kids but one cousin, went to the tree line, where I saw the creature a few hours before. The area where I saw it walking had hoof prints in the dirt and some signs of something dragging. And deep into the trees, there was this one tree that had these huge, deep lashes in it that were obviously fresh and unnatural. My papa said it was probably a deer rubbing its antlers in the tree, but it obviously wasn't. I refused to use the bathroom at night after that and struggled to sleep even more. 2 days later, me and my friends got my papa to go with us further into the tree line. I wanted to see if there were any other signs that something had been there. As we walked into the tree, we showed my papa the markings, but the tracks had faded. Papa said it looked like a coyote had dug its claws into the tree. As we walked deeper and darker, my papa told us to wait and stay where we were, and he continued forward on his own. After 5 minutes, he came back and said we were going back to camp. After returning, he told us he had found 2 more trees marked the same way as the one we showed him and a dead fox. He said the strangest thing was that the fix wasn't eaten or anything, but it had been marked like the trees, but a large portion of its side had been ripped off and tossed farther away from it. He looked disturbed, but said it was probably a coyote who got into a fight and ended up leaving it. That was when I realized what I saw was real. After that, I refused to sleep in the tent and slept on the couch in my grandparents' RV for the rest of the trip. We no longer camp at the site after a couple were found dead 3 weeks later. One Saturday when I was around 13, my uncle came round with his girlfriend and my 2 younger cousins. Our other 2 cousins were staying at the flat for the weekend, and a further younger female cousin had asked Mom if she could also stay. This was a regular occurrence for us kids. The weekends and school holidays were free for all, with a constant stream of kids staying at one place or another, making makeshift beds with beanbags and floor cushions, or just crashing out on the floor with sleeping bags. My mom and aunties all used to joke that during the holidays, their homes turned into regular old DOS houses. Apart from my 5 cousins and me, my friend Jay was there. He too was at our flat every weekend, and his parents knew he would be okay. Mom had the reputation for being cool yet very strict. We all hung out together, had a sandwich and drink, and played on the Sega. Then Mom and my uncle's partner said we should all go for a walk. Everyone thought it was a great idea, so the 10 of us set out. The 3 adults decided that we should go to Donkey Woods, which is a bit of green wild land owned by the council, much like Heathland. As kids, we used to go over a lot in the spring, summer, and autumn on our own or with family, and it was reasonably safe and kid-friendly, and it still felt wild enough to make you feel adventurous, not in West London. We all walked the half-mile down the road from the flats to Donkey Woods, where we walked along the river until we got further into the woods, and while Mom, my uncle, and his partner all sat down to have a cigarette, us 7 kids went exploring. As I've mentioned before, we all knew Donkey Woods really well and were totally at ease and comfortable over there, so we weren't expecting anything unusual or creepy at all. For us, it was just another mid-August late Saturday afternoon, and we were just messing around. My cousin T, my friend Jay, and I were all talking, and suddenly the other 4 kids came running up. They hadn't been too far away, just slightly further down the river. They were all out of breath and looked a little rattled. The 4 of them told us that they had seen something weird in one of the small clearings. They wouldn't tell us, they just said, "You have to come and see." We all thought it was just a major wind-up, but when we got to the clearing, our mood changed quickly, not to fear but more to a sense of unsettling apprehension. In the middle of the clearing, there were 3 small tents in a rough triangle, and in the center of the tents was a small, still smoldering fire. Around the edges of the clearing, I think, were several small dead birds, sparrows. The whole scene was very unnatural and eerie, and I felt a distinct drop in the temperature, most likely my imagination, but still quite evident. Now, the rough sleepers of the area did use Donkey Woods as a base, but not in that particular place of the woods, as it was too close to the main road, and the homeless people avoided harassment from certain unpleasant individuals by going further into the woods to prevent any kind of confrontation. The homeless people who lived above Donkey Woods also didn't use tents. They would make a shelter from pieces of wood and plastic sheeting. Donkey Woods isn't a place where people go camping recreationally, so we felt there was something very strange about the scene in this clearing. I told the 4 younger ones to go and get the adults. While they were gone, me, Jay, and T didn't move. T, who was and still is as tough as nails, was completely colorless. You couldn't see her freckles at all. I didn't even move my wheelchair around the area as I normally would have done, and Jay just kept saying, "What the actual F?" When the adults came back with the other kids, they were clearly unnerved by the odd scene as much as we were, and it was soon agreed by everyone that we should leave the clearing and Donkey Woods immediately. The most creepy part of this incident was that the next morning my uncle went to see my other uncle, and together they went over Donkey Woods to look around more. They went to the clearing, but there was nothing there, not even marks in the ground from the tent poles, no sign of the fire, and no tiny dead birds. My aunt, my brother, my cousin, and I were visiting our grandparents' house in Washington. They lived in a pretty remote area, with only a handful of other houses around and a good chunk of forest between each of them. Keep in mind that it's also kind of an island, so they don't get many funky creatures there. My aunt and I went out while it was dark outside, just walking the path in the forest and trying to figure out what was making a loud noise, not a weird one, just a normal forest sound. I said frogs, and she said crickets, lol. I was right. Anyhow, we pass a pond area and make our way to a clearing. I don't know if this is relevant, but the clearing was a bit small, with an apple tree in the middle. That was where my brother, cousin, and I would hang out whenever we were outside. When we reached the clearing, I immediately got a bad feeling. I figured, it's dark, I'm typically terrified of the dark, and I'm tired, but nothing is really going to happen. The path was a bit overgrown around there, so we decided to turn back. Right before we did, though, I caught a glimpse of what could have been a huge owl up in one of the trees, just staring at us. Now, I'm an Arizona girl, so I don't know what creatures are normal in the forest, but this thing just didn't feel right to me. It just gave me a weird vibe. But my aunt kept walking, and I caught up. Keep in mind that the path was pretty short, and it only takes about 10ish minutes to get to the clearing and 10 minutes to walk back. But when we got closer to the house, we heard my grandmother yelling for us. We run back to the house, and she says we've been gone for hours. We swear we had only been out for at most half an hour, and when my brother and cousin come back, they tell us they had been out looking for us. We check the time, and they're right. Another interesting thing that could be connected is that a few days before that, we had heard some really funky noises coming from the woods while we were out making s'mores. Even my grandparents, who had lived there longer than I've been alive, admitted that it was unlike anything they had heard before. It continued getting closer and closer and stopped any time someone tried to get video of it. Eventually, I had to go inside because it was freaking me out so bad. I have been staying up in the mountains in a small southwest North Carolina town since this past Sunday. I went to town to socialize and have a drink or dinner and came back between 10:30 and 11 p.m. every night. Before anyone says anything about me being drunk or having too many, it's been a single beer that I drank when I first got there, meaning it's been 3 to 4 hours since I had it by the time I have been getting back. Honestly, it's been unnerving getting out of my car at night. It's literally pitch black. The sounds of the animals are super intense since it's so quiet. It was mostly bugs and crickets or whatever, but I kept feeling alert, like I was being watched. I didn't think anything of it, I just thought I was paranoid because of the darkness and bolted down the driveway and into the house. Monday and Tuesday night, same thing. I kept having a weird feeling of being watched, even though I didn't see anything. Then Wednesday night will be a night I will never forget. I was driving back again, and it was a little after 11 p.m. I turned off the main road onto this little gravel road that kind of goes around a bend with thick woods on the left and a cornfield on the right, and of course I had my high beams on since there are no lights anywhere around. I come around the bend onto a stretch of straight road, and I see this massive creature standing in the road. I slammed the brakes on and immediately felt panic because I didn't know what I was looking at. It was huge, like 7 to 8 feet tall and hairy. As I sat there frozen looking at it, it slowly turned toward me and looked for a second, then kind of fast walked or jogged back into the woods on the left side of the road and was gone. However, the way it moved was weird. I can't really describe it, it didn't look normal to me. I know what I saw, but I still don't believe I saw it. I am an analytical person by nature, a software engineer who was raised by scientists who taught me to question everything but always demand proof before you believe it. As such, I never really believed in Bigfoot, per se, as I didn't see proof, but now it's kind of shaken my foundation of how I view reality to the core. I have seen a black bear. I've seen a black bear standing up. It was not a black bear. It looked like a giant gorilla mixed with a Wookiee but was dark colored. Unless a giant gorilla just escaped from a local zoo, I don't have an explanation for what I saw. I'm still shook by it even a day later, and I haven't really slept since because all I can do when I close my eyes is see a replay of that over and over again in my mind, and I honestly don't want to remember it. I just want to pretend I never saw it so I can go back to my own view of reality again. I also noticed that as I drove past where it was, there was a strong smell of what I can only describe as exceedingly strong BO, like if a person hadn't taken a shower for a year times 10. I didn't have the windows down, but I had the vent going because, for whatever reason, the windshield constantly wants to fog up, so I need to blast the air on it while driving to prevent it. Honestly, I don't even know why I am sharing this. I guess it's because I need to get this off my chest and tell someone, and it's better to tell a random group of strangers online than to tell my friends or family, who will all think I am crazy and will talk behind my back. I saw what I can only describe as a Bigfoot, and I kind of feel like I've been being watched by them since I have been here. Maybe the watching part has all been in my imagination, but every time I get out of the car at night, I have a huge adrenaline burst, and I get a knot in the pit of my stomach. I just want to run as fast as I can to get in the house. I've been researching all day and reading everything I can find because I want to understand this more. I am not a person who can have something like this happen and just go on about their life. I need to know more about this now. What it is, why it's here, how it got here, where it came from, etc. I am sure people will tell me I am full of it and I saw something else, but I know what I saw, and I know there is nothing else it could have been. Final update. I left the place this morning and am now back home, but I had another weird situation occur on the way out. Well, I think it was weird, perhaps it was just a dumb chance, but I guess I will explain. I got back around 8 p.m. yesterday, right around when it was dusky, not completely dark but almost dark. Thankfully, I didn't see anything. I decided I would load the car up before going to bed since I was leaving early this morning, at around 4:30 a.m. I had the same weird feeling again, like I was being watched, but quickly loaded the car, went back inside, and went to bed. I woke up this morning, got to the car, and got in to start driving. Going down the mountain road with all the switchbacks and turns, I got to the end of the road I was on to turn into the main road. It forms a T, and about 15 feet prior to the end of the road was a large rock sitting in the middle of the road. That rock was not there at 8 p.m. I go hiking a lot in an area where rock slides happen at times, and usually when that happens, the rocks end up by the side of the road, not in the middle of it. It honestly looked like it was placed there by someone or something in order to force someone to get out of their car and move it. I got the same unnerving feeling as if I were being watched, and I almost started panicking. No way in hell was I getting out, so I very carefully drove a little off the side of the road on one side and managed to get around it. I sped out of there pretty quickly after that. I honestly got the feeling I was being ducked with by them, as if they noticed me loading the car and figured out I would be leaving early, so they made it more difficult or wanted to play a trick on me. I have no proof of this at all, and maybe it's just me being overly imaginative, but I find it difficult to believe this rock could have randomly ended up where it did in the time frame between when I drove past that area at 8 p.m. and 4:30 a.m. It's not like there is a ton of traffic on the road, and I didn't see a place where a rock would have come from, although it's possible stones fall down from there. Honestly, I have gone from being shook to kind of being pissed, not only because I have had my version of reality ripped from me unwantingly, but now that they seemingly were ducking with me too, and I imagine laughing at me the whole time. I'm a man who lives on a 93-acre farm in the middle of nowhere, New Hampshire. The only crime that has occurred is the stabbing of a woman across the road. However, back in June, I was going about my daily business of cleaning out pens, feeding pigs, and putting out hay when it started to get dark. I wrapped up my work and went inside to shower and go to bed. When I opened my window to investigate after hearing what sounded like someone hammering on my car, I was shocked to discover nothing but a dent in my hood. I then walked outside with my floodlight to take another look, but something didn't feel right, and I fled inside, fearing for my life. I don't mind the pushy move, yeah. I tried to go back to sleep when I heard what sounded like someone breathing against the mesh of my open window screen, but the breath was hotter than you would think, and I was immobile. When I got inside, the time was 2:20 a.m. It came on because I was so terrified. The only thing separating me and the person, or what I believed to be a person, was a screen, so I followed it to the kitchen, where I took out a knife and a floodlight, and then I cautiously went outside. As I turned the corner of my house, I noticed something crawling towards me, but it was crawling on all fours. The only thing I could describe as a pale, skinny, bald thing was sticking out its tongue, but it wasn't human. Instead, it was long and had a skin-eating grin. Alarmed, I fled to my house, locked the door, and took refuge in my bathroom until dawn. Though I'm not sure what this was, I do know that 7 of my chickens went missing, and all I could find was dug up soil and feathers. This was brought to my attention when I discovered a decaying chicken in my woods earlier. I worked for the Forest Service for a few seasons in Northern California. I don't want to say what forest I worked for specifically, but it was situated in the coastal range. It's incredibly rugged, remote, and desolate. There are no paved roads going through it. It was ravaged by 2 bad wildfires a few years ago. Even before the fires, it wasn't a super popular destination, aside from locals looking to hunt or ride their OHVs. Most of the work I did was surveying for timber salvage projects after the fires. This meant that I'd be in the car for many hours at a time, due to the ruggedness and the fact that all the roads are unpaved. Sometimes I'd be alone, but other times I'd be with 1, maybe 2 other people. It's really beautiful, but I'd regularly drive 6 or more hours out there each day without passing another car. Because of the fires, some roads became inaccessible, but you wouldn't know it until you tried driving down the road. You might drive for 5+ miles down a road and come upon a road failure or a large tree across the road, trees much larger than those one can buck with a chainsaw. You just have to mark it on your map and turn around. One season, I worked quite often with one particular coworker doing timber cruising. We'd arrive at our spot, get our gear in order, and begin surveying, essentially walking around with a tablet, measuring trees, etc. We'd be walking off trail mostly, sometimes down some seriously steep inclines. There was one particular area I hated working in. It was super remote, even compared to the rest of the forest. It usually took us 3.5 hours to get there from the office. There was nothing specific I could place my finger on, but something always felt off. Sometimes I'd feel immediately nauseous or lightheaded upon getting there. This never happened elsewhere. In most other areas, after surveying for a few hours, we'd stop for lunch and shoot the shit. Sometimes we'd hike around and explore an area just because. I never wanted to do that there. I'd eat snacks to get by and just get the work done, but I never wanted to take lunch or linger there too long. I kept these feelings to myself because I didn't want to be the weirdo and bring up the creepy vibe I got from that place. On my last day of that field season, my coworker and I were talking about the places we'd enjoyed the most in the forest. I jokingly mentioned how much I hated that one spot. He was always a really straight-laced, serious guy. He looked me dead in the face and said, "You felt it too?" Chills ran up and down my body. He mentioned that he always hated going there and that he just wanted to do what we had to do and leave as soon as possible. He also didn't want to bring it up and scare me because we had to go there multiple times. We both agreed there was nothing glaringly sinister about the place, but it just felt all sorts of wrong. Fast forward to the next field work season, this coworker has relocated to another forest. One day I'll be working with the heritage team, flagging off restricted spots in the areas I had cruised the previous year. Of course, we were going to the spot I dreaded. I didn't know the guys on the ARC team well, so I kept my mouth shut. We broke into 2 groups, and I was assisting the head archaeologist for that ranger district. Our job was to map out and flag a perimeter around archaeological sites so that the big logging equipment didn't ruin the sites. When we got to the creepy spot, the archaeologist I was working with pointed out a large boulder. Since the whole forest is littered with giant boulders, you don't really stop to look at them. It had petroglyphs that were sketched by Native Americans hundreds, maybe thousands, of years ago. They didn't know the particular significance of that spot or exactly what the petroglyphs meant, but it apparently was a big deal to the indigenous people that would seasonally camp in that area to forage or hunt. Throughout the day, the archaeologist and I were talking a lot, and I felt more comfortable around him. I mentioned the weird feeling I used to get in that one spot near the petroglyphs. He laughed and said his coworkers hated the spot and refused to go. He was the head archaeologist, so he ended up getting stuck because no one else would. He had no explanation for it. He said it didn't bother him much but that it was just inexplicably weird. Most likely, it was just the absolute desolation of that particular spot that got to me or us. This particular area had burned severely, which drove out the animals and made it eerily silent. That could have added to the unsettling feeling. But knowing the history of the spot made me wonder if it was something more. Back in the summer of 2015, I was enjoying a camping trip with family in central Tennessee. This particular spot in the forest is located in Meriwether-Lewis State Park, and some historical locations are located nearby, including the area where Lewis himself died. I don't necessarily believe this was his spirit, but it was nonetheless an interesting experience. One night, while we were winding down in our RV, we saw a series of brilliant, bluish-white orbs outside the door of our RV. The screen door was closed, but the main door was open, so you could see outside. The door of our RV was not facing any roads or pathways where people were walking, it was just dense forest as far as one could see. Additionally, as I said, the orbs were basically right outside our RV. There were no gas leakages in our RV, so there were no gas leakages that could have been set alight. There were no swamps or bodies of water in the immediate vicinity of our campsite, nor were there thick piles of dead leaves, as everything was in full bloom, and there were no animal carcasses nearby that could have produced any stray gases that could be ignited. We also ruled out ball lightning, as it didn't move the way ball lightning does, nor was there a pop or banging sound accompanying these lights. This was also during an incredibly shitty, perhaps the worst, time of our lives, and the purpose of the camping trip was to unplug edibles to signaling overhead aircraft for help. The final test was one of the most challenging and terrifying experiences of my life. We were to hike 10 miles into the woods, find a clearing, and set up camp. Sounds easy, right? With nothing but a combat knife, a field ration, and a very basic medical kit. We were told by our instructor that due to an incident last year with somebody succumbing to the tolls of being alone in the woods, a combination of loneliness, boredom, and the thought that you aren't going to be rescued can drive even the most confident outdoorsman mad, we were to remove our belts and leave them at base. We drove in a 3-ton truck up a logging road to our location. We were each given a specific grid location, each at least 5 miles away from any other person. We were given instructions to hike to our location. Mine was almost an 8-mile hike through densely wooded marshland, and radio in when or if we reached our location. I had to change my location because my grid left me in a pond. I camped on the shore instead for obvious reasons. I got my bearings, planned out what I was going to do for shelter, and settled in for my 5-night stay there. I'm completely on my own. I decided, since the weather was good and I wasn't planning on staying there for too long, that I'd opt for minimal shelter and focus more on food and water collection. Water wasn't difficult to find. There was a stream just outside of my camp. I put all of my effort that first day into setting traps to catch small game, pitfalls, rabbit snares, and deadfall traps. I thought if I'm going to set traps, I may as well set something to catch a deer. I crafted a swing spike. Essentially, I bent a strong tree branch back and attached several sharp spears to it, connected to a tripwire system. I was very proud of my work. It would have definitely taken down a medium-sized deer. Everything was pretty uneventful. The first few nights, aside from wolves howling in the distance, were quiet. For the first time in my life, I heard nothing but the sound of the woods. It was surreal. On the third night, I heard the swing trap go off. It made a hell of a noise when it hit the tree beside it, which was discouraging, meaning it didn't hit its target. I woke that morning late in the day. The sun was already high in the sky. The first thing on my mind was to check my small game traps. I hadn't had anything to eat since the second night, and the only thing on my belly was water. I went to reset the swing trap and saw something strange. There was blood on one of the spears. The wound must have been deep. The blood covered the first 2 inches of the spear. I noticed something strange near the trap, what looked like a man's bare footprint. I hadn't taken my boots off outside the shelter, and there was nobody around for miles. Knowing that someone is around and wounded makes me feel a little uneasy. What was weird was that there was no trail of blood to follow, especially with a wound of that size. The trap would have hit him square in the hip. I decided to return to my camp and snack on a nearby cucumber leaf, a local plant that grows in the Canadian Maritimes. It's a broad-leafed plant that tastes like cucumber and has berries. Suddenly, a wave of guilt washed over me. I may have killed an innocent wanderer or some weird hermit living in these woods. But I was given very strict instructions not to go more than 200 feet outside my grid bubble. I decided to radio in the incident to command. They told me someone would look into it. 15 minutes later, I hear a chopper circle overhead for about 5 minutes, land about a mile away, and leave quickly. It must have been an air ambulance to pick up my victim, or something. The fourth night was strangely quiet, no bugs humming, no wolves in the distance, no wind, nothing. It was the closest thing to silence I have ever heard. Out of nowhere, every hair on my body stood on end, as if the air around me had been electrically charged. I felt like I was being watched, not just that uneasy feeling you get when you're alone in the woods. I knew I was being watched. A quick gust of wind blew over my shelter, the air was freezing cold, and I could see my breath. The deer trap goes off again, but it doesn't hit the tree this time. I'm scared stiff, and I'm not leaving this shelter to investigate. Suddenly, something breaks the silence. A cough unlike anything I've heard a person make before. It was almost mechanical, almost like the voice of someone with an electronic voice box. It was rhythmic, one cough every 2 seconds or so. The coughing was the only sound. No background noises chimed in from the woods. I psyched myself up to pack up the courage to look through the entrance of my shelter to see what is making that noise. Just outside my shelter, there is a bare foot with tattered jeans around the ankle. I am petrified. I curl back into my shelter, and for the first time in my life, I accept death. I accepted that if whoever was out there wanted to kill me, he could. I cried myself to sleep that night. For the next day and night, I stayed in my shelter. Too afraid of whatever was out there to leave. I was woken up the 6th day by my sergeant. It was past noon, and he was worried I had been injured on my way back to the extraction point. On the hike back to base, I asked him about the chopper, and he told me not to worry about it. I let it go for about 10 minutes before asking again. He noticed that I was genuinely concerned. It was a body recovery. Corporal J hung himself with a rope he made. You were friends, right? He questioned me as if he already knew the answer was yes, then handed me a note. I tracked him to your site. I know I shouldn't have, but I did. He kept coughing and whispering in a language I had never heard before but understood. He wanted a soul. He told me to do this to save you. The man with black eyes wanted you. On November 4, 2023, in Los Angeles, in a remarkable turn of events, people near and far were giddy with anticipation following a rare sighting of the cryptid known as the shadowstalker in the center of California's isolated and historic Sequoia National Park. The local community and cryptid enthusiasts are both amazed and intrigued by the sighting. The encounter happened just last week on a beautiful night deep in the park's dense, hazy woods. During their overnight adventure, a group of experienced hikers and nature enthusiasts came across this mysterious creature. They found themselves enthralled with what they saw. This shadowy-looking creature was quite elusive and stood around 6 feet tall. It possessed the elongated limbs and translucent claws that are characteristic of the shadowstalker. It moved with such grace that hardly a sound disturbed it as it moved through the thicket. Sarah Mitchell, one of the witnesses, described the event as she had never seen anything like it in her life of exploring the wilderness. It appeared to flow through the shadows, disappearing into the night with ease. It resembled discovering a living forest secret. According to local tradition, the shadowstalker is commonly portrayed as a protector of old and hallowed groves, making appearances on heavenly occasions or when the harmony between the material and spiritual worlds is in danger. Some others speculate that the current encounter may have something to do with how the stars align in the night sky. Enthusiasts and scientists investigating cryptids have flocked to Sequoia National Park with the goal of obtaining photographic evidence or additional information about this elusive species. Nonetheless, the shadowstalker is still an expert at hiding and rarely shows himself to outside observers. As they attempt to unravel the biological and ecological mysteries surrounding this cryptid, scientists and biologists are equally captivated by the reports. Expert in cryptobiology Dr. Michael Turner said, "The shadowstalker is a profound conundrum in the natural world. Its capacity to shift between the material world and the spiritual realm calls into question our knowledge of physics and biology." As word gets out about this incredible sighting, those anxious to solve the shadowstalker's secrets congregate in Sequoia National Park. Even if the creature is still elusive, its existence acts as a reminder of the captivating treasures that lurk in the shadows of old forests, waiting to be discovered by the fortunate few. This happened to me a few years ago, when I was 5. I was a pretty active kid. I'd go outside and play any time I got the chance to do so. That being said, because it was the summer, I had every intention to run around outside, pretending to have toy guns. Here are a couple things you should know about the property I live on. Number 1, there's a fairly large pond to the north of our home, only about 200 feet away, that you can easily get to on foot through a small forest between our house and the pond. There are several methods of getting to and from it, as we've cleared several paths over the years. Number 2, we live in a pretty rural area. We're close to other homes, don't get me wrong, but as far as we know, past our house, everything to the north is a few miles of unexplored wilderness. Number 3, we live 100 feet from my grandmother's home. My parents had gone out that day. My dad was at work, and my mom was out getting groceries. I couldn't tell you where my grandfather was if I tried, but at that time we were staying with my grandmother for a couple hours until one of our parents got home. My brother had laid down for a nap, as he was 2 at the time, and I decided to go out and play. My grandmother told me to stay close to the house, so I did. As unrealistic as it sounds, I knew, even at that age, that there were evil people in the world. And being that we lived just down the road from an apartment complex and we would frequently see junkies and other riffraff walking down the road in front of my grandmother's house, I knew this all too well. Something else that's notable is that my grandfather would frequently take me over to that pond to fish. He'd always catch monstrous catfish, while I stuck to my sunfish and bluegills. But we had a rule that was absolutely stressed to my little brother and me from a young age. Do not go over to the pond unless there's an adult with you. Even at 5, I knew the dangers of being alone in the wilderness without an adult with me. Because even then, and today, we know for a fact that people would frequently trek from that apartment complex, across where that pond is, go through a small field to the east, and then follow the road into town from there. So, I was outside playing with a toy gun or something. Doing the general thing a 5-year-old would do. Mouth sound effects and all. All of a sudden, something stopped me. I had heard a voice. As far as I knew, I was the only one outdoors at that time. Then I heard the voice for a second time and couldn't quite make out what it was saying. I checked the back and front doors of my grandmother's home. It wasn't. Then I heard the voice a third time, and I knew where it was. It was coming from my house. But no one was there. And I knew this. So, curious 5-year-old me wandered the 100 feet to my home and started snooping around. I should mention that this voice was yelling something unintelligible from a distance. Not screaming, but more calmly yelling. I heard the voice a fourth time, halfway there, and I stopped dead where I stood. The voice wasn't coming from my house. It was coming from the pond. But what was more was that the voice sounded like my mother's voice. I knew for a fact that my mother wasn't home, and my grandmother was inside the house. The most eerie part about all of it was that the voice was yelling my name. I don't feel safe giving out my actual name, so I'll just refer to myself as Jack for the time being. The voice was simply yelling at Jack over and over again. They'd yell once, then they'd stop for about 5 seconds, then yell again. I knew my mom wasn't home at all. So, who could the voice be? Curious, after another time of hearing my name being called, I called out, "Yeah?" in response. A few moments of silence followed this. A few seconds longer than before. Then, finally, the voice called out my name again. Again, I replied. And like clockwork, I heard my name being called out again, coming from the woods towards the pond. After this, I turned around and headed back. I don't know why, but I wasn't creeped out, and I wasn't scared. Just confused. I told my grandmother, but she chalked it up to be my imagination. Maybe it was. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe somebody was in the woods calling out to someone else, or maybe it was an animal making a sound that I misinterpreted to be my mother calling my name. Regardless, I know that I was convinced then, and even now I am still convinced that it wasn't my imagination. So why do I say that I think it was a skinwalker? Well, if you don't know what a skinwalker is, I suggest you look it up. But I'd only heard about people having experiences with skinwalkers and sharing them. Finally, about 2 years ago, I was listening to a video and heard a story about a person's experience with a skinwalker. Well, again, the reason why I think what I almost encountered was a skinwalker is because the legend goes that skinwalkers can't form entire sentences or speak all together. Only names and sometimes small phrases. We still live on the property where this happened. Since then, I've never encountered anything else like this. 3 or 4 years ago, I was exploring a mostly abandoned city park that was once a World War II POW camp. It's a large area of land with small buildings scattered about. I was with my stepdaughter and stepson. We were in the far reaches of the park, in typical pine tree woodlands, when we heard a sound I'd never heard before. Closest thing I can say it sounded like was wind chimes. We thought it odd, but hey, maybe some hippies set up wind chimes. I can't say how far away the sound was coming from, but my instinct was not terribly far away. We started walking toward the sound. Soon after, it stopped. Shortly after that, the sound started in a different direction. Rinse, repeat, about 3 more times, and we finally decided we should probably just leave. We all heard the same sounds, we weren't on drugs or alcohol, and the sight lines were clear enough that we should have seen or heard someone running around playing a prank. This park is relatively remote, with a single parking area. To get there on foot, you're walking a long way, and it would have had to be multiple people with the distances involved in the sounds we heard. We never saw another soul. And those woods are not the kind you can sneak around in quietly, at least not quickly. I'm sure there's a rational explanation, but any rational explanation I can think of is so far-fetched that it doesn't make a lot of sense. I saw a big, black wolf with red eyes. As the title states, I saw a big black wolf with glowing red eyes in the middle of the afternoon when I was younger. I was outside my grandmother's house playing. I ran around the front yard, and on the right side of the house, I saw this creature. It just stood there and didn't move at all. Being young, it terrified me, and I ran away. Curiosity was also a major factor, so about 15 seconds after I ran away, I went back to where I saw it, and it was gone. She had a fenced-in backyard, and where it was standing, I would have seen it leave the property. This wasn't in a rural area either. This was in a suburb in Connecticut. It is a huge and busy town. Right near the town green. I've searched the internet for years for what this might have been, but I have never found anyone having a similar experience. I've read tales of similar creatures in dreams or whatnot, but never one of them out in a suburb in the middle of the afternoon on a sunny day. Also, it might be important to add that my grandmother did witchcraft or black magic. I don't know if there's even a difference between the two. There was another time me and my younger brother were inside my grandmother's house, and we were walking up the stairs. Keep in mind that this is a very old house with a chapel in it, stained glass windows, and everything. 3/4 of the way up the stairs, we see the literal Grim Reaper walk from the right side, stop at the top of the stairs, and stare at us. We both stopped and looked at each other at exactly the same time, so I know it wasn't our imagination. It then walked into a bedroom on the left. We ran down those stairs faster than you'd think children can run. I don't know if these two encounters could be related in some way. If anyone has any information on what these things could have been, what they meant, or anything else, please tell me. I am 25 now and have been wondering for years what those creatures were. And this isn't one of those made-up stories to scare people. This is legit. Any information is appreciated. So, quick background, I come from a military family, and as such, I lived all over the country, often unable to keep friends for any period of time. I also have insane social anxiety, so I'm overall pretty terrible at making friends to start with. This story starts after I lived in rural Newfoundland for about 3 years, at age 14. I have no friends, my home life is pretty terrible, and I was at this point pretty depressed. I lived on about an acre of land with a river separating us from about 1,000,000 acres of raw forest. I have no idea the size. Big? That had a bunch of ATV trails in it. It was a spooky ass forest, and I have a shit ton of stories about what I saw in there that make most horror movies look like jokes. Of note are the bear trap forest, the 40-foot swamp, the random abandoned suburb, and the house in the middle of nowhere. But those are stories for another time. It was around late August. My parents had told me that, for many weeks now, there had been hoots and hollers coming from our backyard. They had seen flashlights and thought it was some shit kids just trying to break into our garage and steal some beer. There had been times I heard it too, normally in the evening, of just a couple voices periodically hollering, and often I heard several voices speaking from just across the river in the woods. No big deal, a lot of kids hung out in those woods, and due to my oppressive social anxiety, I sure didn't have any desire to talk to them. After this had happened for some weeks, I heard the kids doing their usual thing around 4 in the afternoon and decided, duck it, I'm going to see what's so amusing. So I venture into the woods and go maybe about 300 feet in on an ATV trail my neighbor used, and I meet one of them. I'm going to use their names, as maybe it will give some context to someone. The kid I met was named Jack. He was a year or two younger than me, about a foot shorter, and wearing some really out-of-date clothes. He seemed kind of surprised to meet me, but we said our hellos. I said I had heard them for a while now and came to see what was happening. Jack got super pumped and insisted I follow him on his friend's project. So, I follow the guy, and I'm brought into an area that is pretty clear-cut in a dense path of woods. I knew this area, I hung out in the woods alone a lot and explored, and this was brand new. There were 2 other kids there, one my age named Elvis and an older kid by about 2 years named Louie. They said they were working on a treehouse or fort and wondered if I was interested in helping. I of course said yes, as I had never been asked to hang out with anyone, and they showed me around. Now I need to talk about these kids' clothes. When I say out of style, I'm talking about early 1980s miserable fashion. Neon colors, one kid had shoulder pads, it was a mess. Plus, they wore big rubber boots, and the kids looked, I want to say, new. They had no signs of pimples, their hair was immaculate, and their clothes were crisp as hell. I just assumed they got hand-me-downs from their parents or something. They stated they were all friends, not brothers. So these kids were kind to me, I mean, really nice. I never really got to know them. They never wanted to talk about their home lives, but that isn't surprising given where I lived. We used hatchets, saws, rope, and nails to make a pretty solid fort. We had about 8-foot walls made of birch trees. We made a table to sit at and a lookout post in the biggest tree we could find. The place was about the size of a 1-bedroom apartment, and we were all pretty proud. One day, we were sitting at the table, talking about our favorite trees or something, and I asked Elvis why I had never seen him around before. If he lived near me, he had to go to my school, it was one of 2 in the town, and there was no way he lived in the catchment area of the other one. He insisted he did and wondered why he never met me either. We didn't know the same classmates, and the same people could barely agree on teachers. But whatever, these kids talked to me, and that was enough. So about 2 weeks after meeting them and building this fort, I said I needed to go home and get something to eat. I asked if they wanted something too, as this was basically my backyard and my parents always made too much food. They became downright hostile. Not over the food, they just refused to cross the river. Adamantly. Louie came up with a story about how crossing a stranger's river is terrible luck, but I sure wasn't pushing the issue. Asked if they wanted something, they said yes, and I brought back a pie we could all eat. They apologized for getting angry, said they were very superstitious, and I thought nothing more of it. We had a good rest of the day planning to invade the woods, looking for some thick pine trees. Cut to about a week later. I had gone to the fort, and we did our thing. But today the kids looked haggard. Jack was particularly bad. He looked like he had just gotten the beatdown of his life while catching pneumonia 3 times over. I asked if he was okay, and he said yeah, it was just the flu. But they all also looked wet. Maybe greasy is a better word. They had sick hair, their skin was all shiny and clammy, and their clothes looked like ass. I wasn't shocked, these kids wore the same clothes every day, but so did a lot of the really poor kids in the town. We played around for an hour or so before they left, with Louis saying he would see me tomorrow as Jack and Elvis walked away coughing like they smoked a pack a day. I had told my parents about these kids, they thought they were weird, but a kid with no friends just found out. Don't ask questions. The nighttime hollering had stopped at this point, and we never saw the flashlights again. So the next day I went back with a hatchet and bag of nails in hand, as the plan was that we were going to give the lookout a roof. When I come to the fort, the place is wrecked. The walls had been torn down, the table was in half, and the lookout had maybe 1 or 2 little pieces left. Most notably, everything was rotting. It had been sitting there for decades, rotting. The table was basically nothing, and I could see growth in what had previously been our floor. Strong, half-tree growth. My only thought was what the hell, and I rationalized that maybe someone found out about the fort and wrecked it. So I waited for the kids to come. And the next day. And the next day and the day after that. I waited a week, and I never saw those kids again. I was pretty dejected, and eventually I stopped trying to wait for them. I wanted to look for them, but they never showed me or told me where they live, other than up the hill. My parents noticed and asked why I wasn't hanging out with the kids anymore. I told them what was happening. They dismissed it and just insisted that if they didn't want to be my friends, I didn't need them. I was sad for a good while after that. Cut to today. I'm 29, and I'm telling my wife about these kids I used to hand with, and this time we made a cool fort. I explain how they look and how they act. It's overall a pretty good memory with a sad ending. My wife looks at me wide-eyed and just says, "You hung out with a bunch of spooky ghost kids." I find this crazy, but she says, "Did anyone else see them?" And no, they didn't. They saw a flashlight, but not the kids. They heard them and heard about them, but no one laid eyes on them other than me. There were never any records I could find about them. No one else in the school they supposedly went to knew them, and they never showed me their house or came to mine despite my insistence. My wife said that was some spooky stuff, and I should probably share it. I'm Irish, in Ireland, and as old as Ireland is, these stories about your forests are super creepy. Ireland is old and has loads of castles and old historical settlements. Yes, rural, but just not as vast as what you have. I can't believe people camp for weeks and are out in the woods at 2 or 3 a.m. The only place in Ireland where I've gotten a very lonely, creepy vibe is an amazing place called Three Castle Head in County Cork. It is a small hike up some cliffs, and then it's down in a little valley. It's an old castle ruin and settlement from, like, the 1200s, and it's actually on the cliff, so they'd see anyone approaching. It's way above sea level, yet there's a lake there, which messes with my head. There's supposedly a white ghost lady. If you see her here, it could mean you are going to die. And apparently, blood used to drip inside one of its towers. There was a famous murder in the area of a French woman that became international news. And it was said she used to hike up there on her own all the time, and she had apparently seen the white lady. To this day, her murder is a mystery. But yeah, that place is stunning, but there is a very odd vibe there, like just loneliness or something. When I was probably 4 or 5, I remember my father telling me this story. There was this gnarly dead tree that was the third tree from the left of one of our gates between 2 fields. My dad said that when he was a kid, he and his brother had been out in the woods when they saw a fire in the distance. Being young boys in the early 50s, they went to see what it was. The story he told was that when they came out of one set of woods, they saw a large bonfire near the tree and what appeared to be 3 women dancing around it. They thought it was a party or some crazy paganism. Now this next part of the story is hard for me to remember. It went one of a few ways. Either 3 orbs of fire ascended out of the fire and began winding around the tree, or the women turned into orbs and flew around the tree, or the women just began flying, and the orbs were something else I can't remember. My dad and uncle immediately started running back to the farm, and I think he said that whatever was flying was moving in their direction, but I don't think he was quite giving chase. They went out days later, and there was evidence of a bonfire. Here's the creepy part for me. As a kid, I was afraid of this dead tree because of the story. Most of our dead trees fall at some point just from internal rot after not being sustained. But this tree several years ago sprouted leaves and is now a full tree. It's not something I could miss because, like I said, it's by a gate, and you just count 3 trees over. It's not some tree out in the middle of the woods with a bunch of other trees. I asked my dad about the story after I noticed the tree growing leaves. He kind of chuckled, but more like his nervous chuckle. So I don't know if he is just playing a decades-long joke or what. Unfortunately, now he has brain damage from multiple strokes, and so though I want to ask again, his memory can't really be trusted as to whether he would remember if the story was a joke, just a scary story to tell his son, whether it really happened and he can't remember, or whether it didn't really happen but his brain would trick him into believing it did. It's crazy because, even though his story sounds made up, the dead tree blooming always unnerves me. Every time I open that gate, even now in my 30s, my eyes are fixed on it, like I expect something to happen. Strange happenings in the woods. I am an avid hunter and have certainly seen my fair share of weird shit out in the woods. Specifically, my family's woods. It's not big and isn't too far from the road, so you wouldn't expect too many strange things to go on there, but, believe me, it happens a lot. I figured since I have nothing better to do, I'd type it all here and see what you guys here think. It all started when I got my hunting license and began hunting on my own. I was 15, maybe 16, and was excited to go out on my own. Now, not much can scare me, but those woods get creepy in the dark, and I don't like walking to my spot alone. The first time I walked by myself to my spot, I pretty comically tripped over a branch. If any of you are unfamiliar with hunting, you must know that if you go out into the woods in the morning, you have to get up early, and I mean 4 in the morning early, depending on how far away the woods you're hunting in are. Ours are about 45 minutes to an hour away from us. So it's dark out there, and you cannot use a flashlight until you get to your spot and start setting up. Once I thought I heard someone trailing me while I was walking, but as soon as I stopped, it did too. When I began walking again, it picked back up. It followed me all the way to my deer blind and, several hours later, back to where my dad was sitting. And, while I was pretty paranoid, I brushed it off as a curious coyote or fox. But it kept happening. Almost every time I went out by myself during that deer season, something would trail me all the way to wherever I was sitting and then back to the cars. Another time, during turkey season, while I was walking around looking for a roost, I heard a gunshot. In my ducking ear, now I knew it wasn't my gun going off because I was holding it. I was also conveniently out there by myself that day, so it couldn't have been one of my family members. Plus, it was right in my ear, no echo either. That is probably the most bizarre thing I've had happen out there to date. I have a small shack I built in a tree out in our woods. It's got a gas stove, a cot, and a heater in it. Someone stole my goddamn stove. It wasn't that expensive, just one of those small gas grills you can take with you camping or whatever, and someone took the time to climb 50 feet up into this tree to steal my ducking stove. They didn't even steal it, I found it in the creek that runs through the woods a week later. It looked like someone had thrown it out of my shack in the tree and into the creek. Which I guess could have happened since my shack is next to the creek, but why would you climb all the way up there just to throw my cheap-ass gas grill into the creek bed? Did I mention the time someone slashed my grandfather's deer blind once? We have 3 of them out here, and one got torn right open. Oh boy, were we mad? There was not much we could do, though. My dad blamed it on a stick falling out of a tree, but that doesn't just happen, does it? It's the first day of deer season, and nothing has happened so far. So I went out to the woods after work the other day to check up on my cabin, and my stove is in the creek again. Now if that had only happened once, right after I had used it, I would have said it was raccoons scavenging for crumbs I left on it. But I haven't used it in a while, and I highly doubt raccoons would do the same thing twice. Especially with the dragging it into the creek. I don't know what is up with that creek, but whatever is hanging out in the woods seems to like it because I found my dad's missing blanket in there. I found a dog or coyote skull in there once too. That was interesting, to say the least. Whatever shitlord was following me around last season apparently decided it wanted to do so again because I could hear it behind me. Like, really, it couldn't have been any louder, and I know for a fact it wasn't me because I walk extremely quietly. Even with crunchy leaves underfoot, I have still managed to creep up on my dad and grandfather out there. I found a dead deer out there the other day when I went to check up on my cabin too. It looked like someone had shot it and field dressed it right there on the spot. And they did not do a good job. Even I can field dress a deer better than that. I'll spare you the gory details, but let's just say, there wasn't much left of it when I found it. In the middle of the Ducking Creek bed. Mind you, every time something randomly dies here, it's in the creek bed. Like I said earlier, that's where I found the dog's skull too. I went out this afternoon and found one of the nearby farmers searching our woods. I asked him what he was doing there, and he said that his cattle had been missing. I told him to check around the creek. That was probably a bad idea because, when he came back past me, he said he didn't feel safe around there and asked me to look instead. I gladly did but found absolutely nothing. There is an area around that creek that has a small cliff. And on that cliff is a cave. Now, I have never gone into this cave. I never, even as a small child who loved being in caves, like that cave. It stinks, and it's always cold around the entrance. I think there may be a small spring in there, but why it doesn't flow out into the creek is beyond me. I might go in there someday, but you bet I'll be armed to the teeth. Recently, I haven't been able to go out into the woods because of work and exams, and honestly, nothing really happened during the few times I was out there. Whatever is there apparently like screwing with me specifically because when I was out with a family friend's kiddo during youth season, absolutely nothing happened. No footsteps were following me around, my hunting shack was just fine, and I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. Last weekend, however, I went out there to check up on the place, and there was a car just sitting in the middle of the field. Now, my immediate thought was, OSHT, some dumbass kids went exploring out here and got themselves killed. I couldn't just call the cops, we don't get cell service out there, so I took my gun and followed the creek into the woods. Near that goddamn cave, I found their campsite, or what remained of it. The tents were shredded, and everything had been thrown about and torn apart. There was no blood or bodies, however, so I kept looking around. I found the kids up on a nearby hill, a group of 5 teenagers, 2 girls and 3 guys. They all huddled up against a tree. I told them that they were trespassing on private property and asked what the hell exactly they were doing here. The story I got was that they were driving by and saw our property. One of the guys suggested they camp out there, and everyone stupidly agreed. They drove up, parked their car in the field, and hiked off into the woods. Upon finding the cave, they decided it would be a nice spot to camp. Now why they would set up camp on a rocky creek bed in ducking December is beyond me. But I digress. In the middle of the night, they all woke up to something crunching through the rocks. After a while of this, whatever it was, they threw their cooler at the tent. They tore open the tent and fled up onto the hill, where they stayed for the rest of the night. I escorted the kids back down the hill and back to their cars. They practically clung to me the entire time, especially as we passed the cave. We took a wide berth around that, staying on the opposite side of the creek as I aimed my gun at the cave, partially to make the group of teens feel better, but I'll be honest, I was half expecting something to jump out at us as well. When we got back to their car, they thanked me repeatedly for rescuing them and asked me if I could salvage what little was left of their camp. I agreed and went back to find what I could. I was on edge the entire time, but I did find some peculiar things, not belonging to the kids, mind you. A large, black claw was lodged into the broken cooler, and a fresh trail through the brush led away from the campsite. I guess the claw could have belonged to a coyote or bobcat, but the kids told me that something threw the cooler, not just attacked it. If it were coyotes, they would have heard the howling. I've heard coyotes, those duckers are loud. And bobcats don't just throw things at people's tents. The farmer never found his cows. I know this because I went to ask him for information about the property's history. Apparently, it was once a public park. Didn't last too long though because no one went out there, and those who camped there either died, went missing, ended up like those dumb kids, hiding out somewhere because their camp was attacked, or just straight up went ducking insane. I decided to stay the night out there that night. Bad idea, I know. But I'm a curious person, and I wanted to make sure what everyone was experiencing wasn't just some other asshole kid or a woodland critter. Again, bad idea on my part, but at least I had the brain to not stay in a tent right next to the cave that practically spilled out all the wrong vibes. Instead, I stayed in my shack, with the heater on and an entire arsenal of weapons. My mentality then was that if this thing was going to come after me, I would leave it with more than a few bullet holes. Whatever it is, it now knows I can be a real threat if I want to be. It started off at about 11 p.m. that night. I heard something crashing through the brush towards me, stopping at the bottom of the tree. Now, there was no nightlife because it's winter, so I didn't get the standard all the crickets went quiet that I got during the rest of the year when this thing was nearby. Thinking back, I've noticed a consistency. Every time I hear footsteps behind me or notice something lurking nearby, all the creatures in the vicinity just shut the duck up. I couldn't get this time. But something told me that this was not just a deer or coyote. Within an instant, I had grabbed the nearest weapon and fired a warning shot into the ground near where it stopped. The rest of the night proceeded like this, with me frozen in place, listening for the creature. Every time I heard it get too close, I would fire a blind shot into the ground where I had heard it last. After what felt like years, the sun began to rise. I looked out of the window, and I could see trails through the leaves where this thing had gone. The most noticeable was the one that stopped right next to the ladder into my shack. I have never run through those woods so fast before. I picked up my stuff and booked it out there as fast as I could, carrying a backpack full of rounds and 3 different guns. Well, I can say I won't be doing that again for sure, and I think it's safe to say that those kids learned their lesson about camping on people's private property. I'm fine though, a little shaken up and tired, but I'm okay. I didn't die or get injured. Whatever is out there for sure wants my hide now, though. I'll have to be extra careful going out there at night.
I, a female, was in my early 20s, hitchhiking the west coast of the USA.
I had been dropped off on the outskirts of LA. Exploring the area, I discovered a discreet and overgrown section of cemented canal. I set up my tent there and had an uneventful night. Don't do this, flash floods are real. This morning I left the tent with a few heavier, replaceable items, dog food, canned goods, and went into the city proper to busk. When I returned to camp, my heart sank when I noticed my tent was on the other side of the trickling stream in the canal. I thought someone had vandalized or stolen some of my things. I opened the tent to find everything as I had left it. Exactly as I had left it. I started to gaslight myself. You were tired last night and excited this morning. You came in off a different street. Still, I felt uneasy. It was too late to find a different spot, so I resigned myself to moving my tent back as the footsteps drew closer. I listened. It only sounded like one critter, with no human accompanying it. Trying to calm down, I thought, no need to worry, no need to bother it, it will pass. Until the steps stopped, directly across the stream. It paused, then began sniffing and scratching at the ground. Curiosity got the better of me, and I slowly shifted myself to peek through the netting at the top of the tent. I saw a ghastly creature lurking right where my tent had been. This thing was black and patterned with dust. It was barrel-chested and hunchbacked, with feet that looked too large for it. The creature had a mane of fur from the face down to the back, as a tail should have been, and the rest of its skin was pulled tight against bone. It couldn't have been more than 30 pounds, half the size of my dog, yet I was terrified of it. My gut told me I didn't want this thing to see me, so I scrunched myself back down. I gripped my dog and knife tightly as I listened. It moved back and forth, stopping to scratch or sniff. Its demeanor grew more frantic, its pace quickened, and it began growling and snapping its jaws in the air. I waited silently, knife poised, for what felt like forever. Suddenly, it stopped. It turned and casually headed back down the canal, the same way it had come. I could not sleep the rest of the night. I sat there, gripping my dog and knife, until the sun rose. At the first sign of the day, I packed everything up. Before I left, curiosity got the better of me again. I crossed the stream and looked where the creature had been. The ground was littered with scratch marks. I took a deep breath and left. I've never been back to LA since then. Never before, or since, have I been scared of an animal like that. I can't be certain what happened that dim, humid night. All I know is that I will carry that feeling for the rest of my life. That feeling of being prey to something unnatural. Something sharp, hungry, and skittering. Chupacabra.